scared, and even though we didn't say it, we didn't think we would make it through the night. I had never felt so frightened. With nothing we could do, I pulled his arm around me and fought back tears. I wanted to be strong until the end. We stayed very still for a long time, hardly moving or breathing. The sound of falling water surrounded us as we tried to hide from the danger. Then a light appeared. It flickered in and out, casting long shadows before fading away, leaving us in darkness again. I opened my eyes and saw his arm wrapped around me, strong and steady. It was dirty from our rush to find safety, but every hair on his arm stood up, showing he was alert to what was happening. Later, I cried out for a moment and he pulled me closer, promising that everything would be all right. The light came back, this time brighter, filling the room. We held on to each other tightly. We looked at where the light came from as it flickered, showing items like towels, shampoo, bath toys, and toothbrushes. "Dad?" I sobbed. "Shh, Theo," he said, pulling me even closer as the light filled the room forcefully. "It's going to be okay. Let me keep you safe." This time the light stayed, making the room bright, even though the house had no power. It felt like every light was on just for us. We huddled in the bathtub, filled with water as he shielded me, and the light reflected on the bathroom counter in front of us. Suddenly, flames surrounded us. The heat went from annoying to unbearable. I heard a loud scream and realized it was coming from me. The water that had protected us quickly turned to steam, making it hard for us to breathe. Once the water was gone, I felt my clothes catch fire, and I was in pain as the light grew brighter around us. Even as I felt the heat, Dad tried to cover me. I could smell something burning and heard Dad call out for my mother. He hoped he could protect me, trying to shield me with his body as we both felt lost in a world of discomfort. Everything around me was painful. There was no dark corner left. Everything was breaking apart as bright flames engulfed us, changing not just our lives, but many others as well. We stood facing each other for a long time, each of us lost in our thoughts for different reasons. "Seriously, Brian, how could you not see we were just passing time?" Ava scolded me, making me feel foolish. I started to wonder if maybe I had been a bit silly. I shrugged. "I thought we were building towards something." "Really?" she replied sharply. "If that were true, wouldn't we have moved forward by now? I mean, it's been 4 months, Brian, 4 months of your nonsense." "My nonsense." I paused, feeling worn out and undervalued. "Ava, why are you here?" I believed Ava and I had been in a relationship. We had known each other for 4 months, and she had been my girlfriend for 3. We had met through a friend at a gathering. We had gone out several times, and while we hadn't gone all the way yet, we had shared some close moments. I thought we were progressing, so this breakup talk caught me off guard. "I came to get my things," she said, her arms crossed as she glared at me. "What things?" I asked, my irritation growing. She had been distant for the past week, and I was frustrated that she sent a text earlier about coming over without explaining anything else. I had thought we would have dinner, talk about our weeks, and she would tell me why she had been avoiding me when it felt like we were getting closer. My sharp comment about her things made her blush, but she remained defiant. At 24, Ava was a bit heavy-set with blonde hair and brown eyes. She had a pretty face, and I'll admit her looks caught my attention now and then. I thought we got along well enough, and I had hoped it would turn into something more. That was until I saw the look of disdain when I opened the door just moments ago. "My bag and some items. That's what I meant," she said vaguely. She wanted something from me but seemed determined to keep it vague, as she tried to get what she wanted without stating it clearly. A light bulb went off in my head. "Wait here," I said, and then I turned and walked into my bedroom. I returned quickly, tossing a pink bag at her feet. It was a bag she had brought weeks ago when she mentioned staying over, but never did. "Go now," I told her sharply as she opened the bag, searching through it as if looking for something specific. "Where is it?" she asked, giving me an annoyed look. "What is what?" I replied, pretending not to understand. "The bangle," she said. "Oh, you mean this?" I answered, holding up a pretty bangle that I bought for her last month. I twirled it around my finger. It cost about $150. Ava had loved it, so I bought it to impress her. She left it here before, and now she clearly wanted it back, but I wasn't giving it to her. "That's it. Give it to me, Brian, and I'll leave you alone," she said, frowning as she realized I had what she wanted. "Nope," I replied with a smirk. "This was for my girlfriend, and that's not you. So go on and leave my life, but the bangle stays with me." "You're awful, Brian. It's mine," she shot back. "I don't know why I even went out with you. People warned me about you. The only good part was you bought me things. Just give me the bracelet." Hearing her say people thought I was a fool annoyed me. I knew it wasn't true, but the nickname she used made my emotions rise. It was a hurtful taunt from my past, thanks to the scars on my body that I faced daily. Ava had never called me that before, but it was clear she had talked to people I didn't like. "Leave now," I hissed in a low voice. "Get out of my house and don't talk to me again." Instead of leaving, she put her hands on her hips and laughed. "Why, Crispy? Did I hit a nerve?" she sneered. "For the last 2 weeks, I've been with Brian Dumont. He laughs about everything he takes from you. Your girls, your pride. He's everything you're not handsome and charming." She didn't get to finish what she was saying. I met Brian Dumont back in elementary school. He was a new student who moved from France in 3rd grade. His family was well off, and he had the kind of charm that made him popular. In contrast, I felt very different from him. I was not a small kid. In fact, I was one of the biggest kids in school, while Brian Dumont was the smallest in his class. He disliked me from the first day he saw me. Within a week, he gave me the name Crispy, which came from the burn scars that cover much of my body, including my arms and the left side of my face. Brian hated sharing the same first name with someone like me. He made it his goal to embarrass me whenever he could, looking for chances to get back at me. He even took my girlfriend, Ava. She didn't know it, but she would be out of his life the moment she left here today. Once she learned how I had sent her away, her time with him would be over. I don't like violence, but before Ava could finish what she was saying, I took her by the arm and pushed her out the front door of my house. Her pink bag followed, hitting the side of her pink Nissan Micra parked in my driveway. While she stood there in surprise, I slammed the front door shut, not caring what she might do next, and went into the kitchen. I threw the bracelet she wanted into the trash and, out of frustration, dumped my leftover chicken scraps on top of it. I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and drank it in one go. I then let out a loud belch, but no one was there to hear it. With all the anger brewing inside me, I felt like I could have cooked dinner with the heat coming off me. It wasn't just that I was upset about making dinner for 2 or that Ava had acted poorly. I knew she had a tendency to do that, so it didn't surprise me. It was also that Brian Dumont had troubled me again. No. It was really about my life in general and how the world treated me. Not one to waste food, I cooked and then ate dinner while still feeling angry. I almost pushed my knife and fork hard enough to break the plate. After another beer, I stomped down the hallway to the shower, feeling like a child who had been scolded. I knew my behavior was immature, but I could justify it to myself. I managed to keep my rage from causing any damage to my home. I undressed, and when I got into the shower, I realized I still felt a bit dirty from working that day. I worked as a laborer for a local landscaping company. It was honest work, and being a larger guy, I had the strength to do it well. Most of the guys I worked with ignored my scars and how I looked. When it did come up, they were generally the only group who didn't treat me like an outcast. I realized Ava was not being honest about her comment. I met her through some friends who always supported me. There was a time when my boss hired someone who seemed to know Dumont. This guy kept calling me Crispy all day, laughing and trying to get others to join in. He didn't show up the next day. I found out that he was let go after complaints were made to the boss. After a moment of standing under the hot water trying to cool down, I grabbed my shower gel and fumbled to open it. I was still upset. After my skin grafts, I learned that staying clean was really important to avoid skin infections. I was more likely to get infections than most people, so using soap and shower gel was necessary. When I stepped out and dried off, I looked in the mirror. Overall, I was a tall guy with a strong build. My long brown hair fell past my shoulders. At work, I tied it back. But outside of work, I let it hang to cover my face. I had a noticeable scar on the left side of my forehead, which ran down over my left eye, cheek, and mouth, finally ending on my chin and neck. My left ear had been fixed, but it didn't look quite right, so I often kept my hair over it. My chest had fewer scars, with just one spot on my left side showing where the skin graft had changed color. However, my back was covered in scars, with many patches from skin grafts and discoloration where the skin hadn't fully healed. My left arm told a difficult story. It looked different from my right arm because my skin couldn't grow normally as I matured. It had a purplish look with visible veins. My right arm had lighter scars, but still showed the marks of what I had been through. Even my backside had scars that matched my back and ran down my legs. I was fit and strong, but anyone who saw me without clothes would probably be shocked. When I turned into a teenager, I started to wear long-sleeved shirts and long pants all the time. I didn't want anyone, even my family, to see my skin. You might be wondering how I got these scars and why I had such severe burns that some kids like Brian Dumont would tease me while others, like Ava, would make fun of me. Some children even ran away crying when they saw me. The truth is, it all started when I was 5. My parents went out for dinner one night, and a girl next door named Tilly, who was 16, was watching my little sister Harper and me. A fire broke out in the kitchen because the oven wasn't turned off properly. By the time the smoke alarm went off, Tilly, who was watching TV, was unable to do much. She got to my room and pulled me out while coughing from the smoke. But when she tried to go back to get Harper, it was too late. The house was on fire. Even though I was still half asleep, I ran back inside to save Harper, not fully understanding the danger. When firefighters arrived, Tilly was crying and being held back by neighbors who didn't want her to run in. They found me huddled around Harper in her room, trying to protect her as flames licked the walls. My clothes were burning, and part of my body was also on fire as I held onto her. We were both screaming in pain and fear. I will always be grateful to those firefighters. They are brave heroes who risked their lives for us. If they had arrived just a little later, neither Harper nor I would have survived. They carried us out and rushed us to the hospital. I received emergency treatment to stop the burns from getting worse, and then I was put into a special sleep for nearly 10 days while they worked to save me. When I woke up, I was confused and didn't understand what had happened. All I knew was that my body hurt and I couldn't move. I spent almost 10 months in a clean tent where the doctors worked hard to heal my skin. The only people I saw were my doctors and my parents, who wore special suits to protect against germs. Harper had burns on her arm, but thankfully, she didn't need the painful treatments that I did for my more serious injuries. Through it all, Harper has been my biggest supporter. She sees me as her hero, the one who saved her. Throughout school, she even got in trouble for fighting anyone who called me mean names. 3 times, she was sent home for getting physical with Brian Dumont. As for me, the doctors did a wonderful job. After 7 surgeries, my face looked almost normal, even if I resembled a character from a monster story more than a regular person. For the first year, after leaving the hospital, I refused to go outside. I threw fits whenever my parents suggested we go out. But eventually, with Harper's help, I started to visit places. It was hard for me, as people stared. Parents were shocked, and I noticed some babies crying when they saw me. I began school a couple of years late, starting the same year as Harper. Until high school, we were in the same class. She was my best friend, my secret keeper, and my shield. Even though I was much bigger than the other kids, she stood by me. If it wasn't for my little sister, I might have never learned to read or write. As I entered high school and grew older, I became the biggest kid in any grade. My dad's family has always had big and strong men. The women were tall and elegant. I inherited that. And without trying, I started to grow bigger. I quickly outgrew most of my bullies, so they began to tease me when they thought I wasn't around. But they soon learned I was a gentle giant. I faced their teasing week after week. I knew I looked different, so I expected it. I kept to myself, focused on my studies, and rarely talked to anyone besides Harper. After graduating, I got a job with a local landscaping company thanks to my dad's connection with the owner, Jeff. Jeff had known me for many years and would speak firmly to anyone who bothered me about my looks. The first few months were tough. I worked long hours, digging and moving dirt. I was strong, but had to build endurance for the heavy work. After a year, I was seen as one of Jeff's most reliable workers. He paid me well and encouraged me to attend local vocational training to earn a certification in landscaping. 2 years later, I received my diploma. With my job, little social life, and careful spending, I saved enough money to buy a house. I usually didn't talk to anyone outside my family or the guys at work. Even then, I rarely accepted invitations to meet up after work on Fridays. They said they supported me, but I wasn't ready to face any teasing. To avoid the curious looks from others, I did my shopping late on a Thursday night using the self-checkout. I wasn't completely isolated, but people's reactions to my appearance often made me want to steer clear of crowds. As for meeting girls, I quickly learned to keep my distance from women outside of my mother and sister. In high school, I liked a girl, and it took me 3 months, with encouragement from Harper, to gather the courage to talk to her. I was surprised when she responded. Even more surprising was when she asked me out 2 days later. But my surprise turned to embarrassment when I arrived for the date and found her with Brian Dumont and his friends, who were laughing. When I got home early, Harper asked what happened. I didn't want to talk about it and preferred to hide in my room. It took her 3 days to get me to share the story. And the following Monday, Harper got in trouble for confronting Brian. When I got a bit older and moved into my own place, I ran into a friendly woman a few times while shopping late at night. She smiled at me, and I noticed she didn't seem too bothered by my looks. But when I mustered the courage to talk to her and ask her out, she politely let me know I wasn't her type. I got the hint. It seemed I was different. Then there was Ava. A co-worker, Brad, mentioned that his wife knew a girl who had been single for a while and wondered if I would be open to a blind date. I shrugged and thought, why not? I went to the Saturday barbecue at his house and met Ava. When I met her, I wasn't put off by her appearance. She was nice, if a bit needy. For the first time in a long while, I felt relaxed around a woman who wasn't family. A kiss when I dropped her off after the movies didn't feel explosive. But it was nice. It was my first real kiss. Seeing myself as someone different, I was happy to enjoy what I could get. In my daydreams during those months, I imagined being close to Ava. However, as I looked at myself in the mirror today after my shower, reflecting on recent events, I knew it wouldn't happen. I walked to my room, climbed into bed, and for the fourth time, watched an episode of The Sandman on Netflix. The character Dream felt like he could be a good friend to me, but unlike me, he was charming and attractive. As I fell asleep, I felt more alone and sad than ever. The next morning, I made a leisurely breakfast and spent an hour mowing the lawn and tending to my garden. In the middle of my yard, I had a simple wooden bench where I liked to sit and enjoy the peaceful surroundings. When I first moved in, I had planted several flower bushes and fruit trees. I loved taking care of them, pulling weeds and trimming branches. My property wasn't huge, but over the years, it grew lush and green. Best of all, I had my own space without any disturbances. I had only met my neighbors a few times, and we kept our distance but were polite to each other. After spending my morning in the yard to clear my mind from the previous night, I took a shower and changed my clothes. Then, I hopped into my 3-year-old Toyota Hilux and drove to my parents' house. As soon as I arrived, my mom, dad, sister Harper, and her boyfriend Trey noticed I seemed a bit down. They quickly tried to cheer me up. Harper laughed as I told a toned-down version of my story, avoiding any bad language for my parents' sake. "She was just not nice anyway, right?" my sister said, sounding upset for me. "Harper, watch your words," my mom said in that way that meant I was in trouble. I chuckled, and Harper smiled back at me. "Brian," she said more seriously, placing her hand on my arm, "when you meet the right person, they won't notice the scars. They'll see the wonderful person inside. You are a hero in your own way." I nodded. Harper often said nice things like this to me. I didn't quite believe it, but it was easier to agree than argue. For the next month, things continued as usual. I heard at work that Ava had only spent a short time with Dumont before he broke up with her in front of many people at a cafe. After everyone found out what happened, several of her friends turned away from her, including the partners of my co-workers. When I heard the news, I just smiled and told everyone to focus on their work. These days, I was leading one of the 4 landscaping teams that belonged to Jeff. We had some good contracts with our local councils, working on the gardens around parks and highways. While these gardens weren't the most colorful, they were designed to help reduce noise and clean the air, and our team did great work. One Wednesday, about 2 months after what my co-workers called the Ava incident, we were finishing a job when Jeff drove up and approached me with intent. "Hey, Brian, it looks like you're almost done," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "We finished a day early because the ground was easier to work with than we thought. The area will be ready for a playground next month." "Nice work," he said, sounding somewhat distracted. "Hey, Brian, can we talk about something?" My boss's voice surprised me. He sounded serious and a bit unsure. "Sure," I answered carefully. "You know about the fundraiser we have coming up?" he asked. I nodded. I was aware of it. This was the 3rd time he had asked me to go, and I had turned him down each time. Jeff's business was supporting a charity event for children in the burns unit at our city's hospital. The goal was to give the kids a fun day and raise money for new medical equipment that the government could not afford. Yes, I understood it was a good cause, especially since I was a burns victim myself. But being around other burn victims, especially children, was very hard for me. The idea of facing others who might judge me made me anxious. "I'm not trying to make you go, Brian," Jeff said, looking worried. "I know you're not comfortable with that, but I need someone to help set things up. Baz was going to help, but he got sick and won't be able to make it Saturday morning. I paused for a moment, then let out a breath. "Okay," I said finally, and he looked relieved. "But just for the setup. He'll leave after that." The event was taking place at New Farm Park, one of the bigger parks in Brisbane. I picked up a layout map from Jeff to see where I would be helping and then got to work. I was impressed by how well the event was organized. They made great use of the park's space. There were rides for everyone, stalls selling all sorts of fun items, food trucks with delicious snacks, a stage for performances, and even auctions and fashion shows throughout the day. I wondered how they could afford this big event. It seemed like the costs, permits, and insurance would be high. When I talked to Jeff later, he chuckled and agreed, but he added that the many attendees and marketing would help bring in a lot of money for both the machines needed and the businesses involved. Plus, most people helping out were volunteers, and many supplies were donated. Jeff believed that by involving our teams, we could gain new jobs and recognition for the company. Before sending me off to help move chairs into a large tent, he reminded me that the kids would really appreciate a fun day out. I had to admit it was true. The kids deserved a break. While I was in the Burns unit, I often felt so bored and stuck. There were only so many times I could watch the same old VHS tapes of cartoons. After spending many months in the clean tent, I wanted to see more than just the trees outside the Burns unit. I found out that the preparations for the afternoon had been happening for almost a week. Even though I only spent a few hours in the morning helping to move equipment, it was strange that people weren't looking at me with fear or pity for once. Instead, they looked at me with interest and asked if I was excited for the afternoon and evening. Most of them were very sincere, and for once, my usual bitterness didn't come to the surface. I smiled and said it should be lovely weather for an outing. A few times, people asked for my business card. I was wearing one of Jeff's shirts and happily handed them out, as I always kept some in my wallet. Around 11, I got a text from Jeff to come over to the main area. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Harper and Trey standing with him. I hadn't mentioned Trey much before. He is Harper's boyfriend and one of the few guys I can easily talk to outside of family and work. He is my age, 2 years ahead of Harper and me in school. They met at university, and he didn't mind either Harper's arm or my scars. He had an older sister with Down syndrome, so disabilities didn't bother him at all. Trey usually followed my sister wherever she went. I had no doubt they would end up married one day. 6 months ago, they had moved in together, and Mom had started hinting about possible grandkids in the future, which made Harper laugh. As I walked up to the group, I hugged Harper and shook Trey's hand. "Hey, bro," Harper said with a smile. "Have you been helping out this morning?" I nodded. "Yeah, Baz is unwell, so I'm filling in. I'll be off soon." No, my sister said, shaking her head. "Here." She handed me a backpack. "This has a change of clothes. Go get changed over there and come back. You're with us this afternoon." All three of them noticed my panic. Me? Out in public? With lots of people? That wasn't something I wanted. "Brian," Trey said softly, "it would really mean a lot to Harper if you stayed. You don't have to do anything but be with us, and you can choose if you want to talk to anyone." I looked at Trey, then at Jeff, who looked pleased, and finally at my sister's hopeful face. They all knew that if anyone could convince me to stay, it would be her. I sighed. "All right," I said, feeling defeated. Harper started to cheer, and I held up my scarred hand. "But I'm not talking to anyone I don't want to. And if someone says something weird, I'm leaving." I came back a few minutes later feeling more unusual than ever. Harper had packed me a pair of jeans and a blue short-sleeved shirt that I usually only wore at home. Whenever I stepped outside, I preferred long sleeves to cover my scars. but I couldn't complain too much, since Harper was wearing a top that showed the big scars on her arms. She linked her arm with mine. Smiling widely, she led me where she wanted us to go. Just before we started walking, I spotted someone. "Hey, Baz," I called to the person coming up behind Jeff. He turned. "Hey, Baz," he replied before looking at me and then back at Baz. "Glad to see you're doing better." "Yeah, Baz, it was a quick recovery," I added with a hint of sarcasm. Both of them turned a little pink. I looked down at my sister, who still had her arm locked in mine, and she grinned, happy her plan worked. "Brian, you're going to have a great afternoon," she told me as she guided me away from the crowd toward the food trucks. "Can you buy me one of those pulled pork sandwiches?" You know what? After the food and wandering where my sister wanted to go, she was right. I was having a great afternoon. Harper stayed close to me, and I felt joyful. We walked through some stalls that were still getting ready. A few times, she recognized the vendors and introduced me as her brother, who had helped her when we were kids. I was surprised when several vendors called me a hero. After seeing my scars, they refused to take my money when I tried to pay for something Harper liked. I was also surprised when we saw a couple of our old doctors from our childhood. Both times they hugged Harper and me, telling us how great we looked. I think they were just being nice, especially to me. But they smiled and spent a good half hour walking around with us, introducing us to people they knew. They also mentioned that I was very brave for running into a fire to save my sister and protecting her at my own risk. Once again, the vendors wouldn't take my money for our dessert. The word hero was used a lot, and while I felt a bit shy, it was nice not to be looked at suspiciously, or like I didn't belong. As the day went on, our parents arrived, and Mom hugged me tightly, as if she hadn't seen me in a long time. She told me how proud she was of me for coming out for the event. Even my dad gave me a hug and smiled. I was surprised when the word hero came up during our chat. Harper was glowing after each conversation, and I could see she was trying not to say, "I told you so," while I was working hard to hide the smile that wanted to shine through. All afternoon, I didn't feel like the monster I used to think I was. Instead, I felt like a real person. We were enjoying ourselves when the kids from the Burns unit arrived. They brought special buses to take the kids from the hospital to the park, which was just a short ride away. Sadly, not all the kids could join us. Some were too unwell or at risk of infection, but I was glad to learn that a special meal, fun activities, and toys were being sent to those who couldn't make it, so they wouldn't miss out completely. When the buses pulled up and the kids began to get off, my friends and family, including my parents, Harper, Trey, Jeff, two of my doctors, and a few of my co-workers with their partners, helped guide the kids through the crowd to their special area. No one questioned us as we moved through. We just helped. As I looked at the kids, I noticed they seemed unsure about how the adults would see them. I remembered what it felt like when I was a scared child who was badly hurt. I watched as people stepped aside. Many smiled sadly, some turned away, and I saw a few women wipe away tears as the kids walked by. Most of the kids could walk, as their burns had healed enough or were not serious enough to need much help, but some were in wheelchairs, able to come out for the day but needing assistance to move. As we walked with the kids, the crowd continued to part for us. I felt sad for those kids who couldn't play, run, or jump, and who needed help just to be here. But they were here, and the whole event was meant for them. When we got to the games area, where all the fun activities were set up, I smiled even as a tear rolled down my cheek when I saw the children trying their luck at the games. "Are you all right, Brian?" Harper asked me as I watched a group of kids playing a ring toss and winning prizes. I sniffed as I saw another group giggling while playing with a clown figure. I felt both happy and sad watching them, torn between wanting to laugh at their joy and feeling upset for the challenges they faced. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I whispered softly. "Harper, I've been so focused on myself. I mean, these kids. I could have been there for them." My shoulders drooped as I realized I shouldn't have stayed away from the burns unit. When Harper, my family, or my doctors asked me to visit, I should have gone instead of hiding. Feeling overwhelmed, I knelt down, watching as each child won a prize at the games, no matter the outcome. I felt really sad when I saw two kids, probably a brother and sister, playing a game together. The sister was in a wheelchair, and she had lost most of her hair. Her burns covered almost as much of her skin as mine did. Her brother had burns too, with both of his arms and one leg wrapped up. I couldn't help but gaze at them as Harper, who was with me, noticed where I was looking. She smiled kindly. The little girl was cheering as her brother played the game for her. He was happily accepting a big pink unicorn toy on her behalf. Both kids were smiling brightly, and I found myself swaying back and forth, remembering when Harper and I were younger. "Come on, Brian, let me introduce you," my sister said after a moment, helping me stand and walk over to the children. There was security all around the kids, since they were in the games area, and the public wasn't allowed too close while they were having fun. But Harper knew them, and the three of us, including Trey, were allowed to go through right away. "Hey, Tim. Hey, Sonia," Harper said with a big smile. "How are my favorite twins?" Both kids turned at Harper's voice, and their faces lit up with huge smiles. "Harper!" they both shouted together. "Look, Harper," the little girl said, holding up the unicorn. "Tim won me this toy." "You're such a good brother, Tim. Sonia is lucky to have you," Harper praised the boy. I stood quietly, unsure of what to say. Then Tim and Sonia noticed me, standing behind Harper, and their eyes widened. "Who are you?" Tim asked, looking me over. "You look like us, but bigger." Harper laughed and reached for my hand. "Do you remember when I told you about my big brother, who saved me from the fire when I was your age?" she asked, and they both nodded. "Well, this is my hero, my big brother Brian." I bent down and shook Tim's hand, and with the nurse's permission, I gave Sonia a friendly kiss on her cheek. "Are you really the Brian?" Sonia asked, amazed. I looked at Harper, and she smiled back at me. I nodded. Her burns were similar to mine. Harper told me later that she had already gone through several surgeries. With new advances in care, she would likely look better in time, even though it would still be hard for her. "Tim was brave like you, Mr. Brian," Sonia said. "He saved me when our house caught on fire. Tim is my hero." I glanced at Tim, who was beaming but then turned serious. "But I couldn't save Mom and Dad or Steph," he said, his face showing sadness as they both looked like they might cry. "Hey now," I said, trying to hold back my own tears. "Let's not focus on the sad things. How about we think of something happy?" "Like what?" Sonia asked, her nose sniffing as she remembered their family. "Well," I replied, pausing for a moment to think, "how about meeting some new friends like me?" Tim and Sonia tried to smile, and then a new idea came to me. "I know," I said, with a grin, recalling something that always made me happy as a child in the hospital. "I saw an ice cream truck back there. I love chocolate mint ice cream. How about you, Tim?" The young boy nodded eagerly. "Yeah, that's my favorite too." "And you, sweet Sonia?" I asked the little girl. She hesitated, unsure if she should smile. "I like strawberry." "Then it's strawberry for our brave princess," I said, as if that were the best choice. Harper and I took the kids to get ice cream, enjoying the treat together. We spent the next half hour wandering through the amusement area. I won Tim a stuffed lion, telling him it was a reward for his sister's unicorn win. Then we found a nice spot on a hill where we could see the stage, a special area just for kids and their guests. As we settled down, I learned more from Harper and the kids' nurse. Tim and Sonia had been in the burns unit for a little over 8 months. A house fire had tragically taken their parents and older sister. Firefighters saved Tim and Sonia, but they couldn't save the rest of the family. Now, as orphans, they were under state care, staying in the hospital until they were strong enough to move to foster care together. The nurse told me that Tim and Sonia were usually brave for each other, but there were moments when they cried while missing their family. I felt Harper gently hold my hand, wiping a tear from my cheek as I listened to their story. And I returned the gesture for her as well. As the afternoon went on, more families arrived at the venue. I was curious about what was happening when suddenly almost every kid screamed with excitement as something started on stage, including Tim and Sonia. Surprisingly, the popular children's group, The Wiggles, appeared at the event. For the next 40 minutes, the stage filled with cheerful children's songs. Kids danced and sang along, even Sonia in her wheelchair, who bobbed her head to the rhythm. It was a little strange for me. A few times I couldn't help but laugh at the lively dance moves of the kids. Sonia reached out her hand, and I carefully took hers, swaying lightly while dancing to the music for her. Occasionally, I felt someone looking at me, not in a way that felt uncomfortable, but more personal. Yet when I glanced around, I only saw the kids, Harper, Trey, and their nurse. After the performance, the group members came over to greet many of the children in the VIP area. A photographer took pictures of the Wiggles as they greeted their young fans. I was surprised when the group, dressed in bright colors, asked Harper and me to pose with them. Harper was a natural in front of the camera, and I think I managed to look okay too. Later, there were many tears as the children were helped onto the buses to return to the hospital. I promised I would visit Tim and Sonia soon, and Sonia made me promise with a pinky swear before she would let them load her onto the bus. "You're a good man, Brian," Trey said, putting his hand on my shoulder and wrapping an arm around my sister, who was crying as the buses pulled away. "Thanks," I replied, feeling a bit choked up, waving and smiling at the departing buses. I'm glad you encouraged me to come today." Harper looked at me with bright eyes. "I knew you would make a difference, Brian," she said. "Those kids have struggled like we did, and even with my scars, you showed them that life goes on and you can still find joy. Your ice cream idea was perfect." "Thanks. It helped me too. I feel lighter and happier," I replied honestly. I turned back to the event, which was still lively. "So what's next?" Harper jokingly placed a hand on her chest. "Oh my, did my brother just mention wanting to be out in public more?" I laughed. "Enjoy it while it lasts, sis," I said. "I'm feeling good today." My sister led us back through the booths, and I met some of Harper and Trey's friends. They welcomed me warmly, not like a stranger, but as Harper's big brother. I blushed several times as she introduced me, and they treated me like I was really special. Harper also introduced me to some other adult burn survivors who were, like me, just trying to live their lives without drawing too much attention. By late afternoon, there were almost 24 of us enjoying each other's company. For the first time, I felt like I belonged and was truly appreciated. As the sun began to set, bands started performing on stage, and we all moved closer, singing and dancing together. A couple of hours later, we found ourselves near the front as the MC, a lady from the local news, took the stage and announced that the fashion show was about to begin. She explained that the models and designers had donated their time for this event, and each outfit would be auctioned off later in a special tent, with all the money going to help the kids. I was smiling and laughing, and I could see how happy Harper was to have her big brother enjoying this time with her. She hugged me just as much as she hugged Trey, and it felt nice. For once, it felt really nice. As the fashion show began, models walked down the runway wearing outfits from around the world. We all gasped and cheered as each model was introduced and showed off their outfits. There were some playful whistles as the girls and then the guys walked by. The models stayed professional and ignored the attention. I have to admit I felt a bit jealous of the guys as they walked down the runway with their perfect skin and looks that could make anyone admire them. At one point, I closed my eyes and wondered what it must feel like to be admired like those models. I got lost in my thoughts until I noticed that the crowd had gone quiet. Opening my eyes, I saw that one of the models, who was stunning, had stopped in the middle of the runway. What surprised me more was that she was staring right at me. At first, I thought that she couldn't look away from someone so different, like me with my scars. But as the quiet grew, the model, who I remembered was named Lurandra, pointed at me and waved me closer with a simple gesture. She wore a beautiful white dress that reached her ankles and flared out gently, almost like a wedding train. There was no doubt that Lurandra was looking directly at me and not at anyone behind me. Just like that, the people in front of me moved aside, and I found myself closer to any woman than I had ever been. The silence in the crowd was so thick, you could hear a pin drop as the music stopped, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. Lurandra knelt by the edge of the stage and motioned for security to let me through. I walked up to the stage, feeling nervous, yet curious about what was happening. She looked down at me with her warm brown eyes, and I felt calm as she reached down, placing a hand on each of my cheeks. She leaned closer until our foreheads touched, and I closed my eyes too, feeling the connection. Lurandra didn't pull away or seem bothered by my scars. Instead, she held me gently as the crowd watched. After what felt like a long moment, she finally spoke, saying, "My hero." Her words surprised me, and I opened my eyes to look at her. Those beautiful brown eyes, her flawless skin, and her kind smile were all I could focus on. She held my face in her hands as I thought about what she said, her voice ringing softly like a bell in the wind. Before I could ask her why, she did something surprising. She leaned down and kissed me. I had been kissed before. My mom and Harper had kissed me as signs of affection, but those were family moments, not intimate. I had kissed Ava, but that felt more like kissing a sister. It was nice, but I didn't understand why poets wrote about it or why it was such a big deal in movies. Kissing Ava was pleasant, but it didn't change my life. But when this remarkable woman who had traveled the world and was admired by many pressed her lips to mine, everything changed. Even with thousands of people around us and other models on the runway, Lurandra kissed me. She held my cheeks, and her lips were soft on mine. I felt her urge, her wish for me to kiss her back. I slightly opened my lips and caught a hint of mint and freshness, but then her tongue touched my lips, and the kiss continued. I closed my eyes again and felt like there was no one else around. Great kingdoms rose and fell. The earth changed and cities grew and faded, but we continued to kiss. Time seemed to stop, and I didn't care what happened next. Lurandra's lips took over my thoughts. Then, too soon, she pulled back, still smiling at me. I stood there in shock as she slowly stood up, her hand lingering on my cheek before it dropped away. I watched her walk away confidently, as if nothing had happened. When she reached the end of the stage, the crowd erupted in cheers. but I barely heard it, still lost in the moment. I touched my cheek where she had held my face and ran my tongue over my lips, remembering the kiss. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People I didn't know patted my back and congratulated me. I recognized Harper, Trey, Mom, Dad, Jeff, Baz, and a few others talking to me. But I couldn't remember what they said or how I responded. When I got home, I fell straight into bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I wondered if the whole thing had been a publicity stunt. An international supermodel calls out the most noticeably scarred person in the crowd, kisses him in front of everyone, and then walks away. Was she just trying to show the world how kind she was? It would definitely make the news and help her earn more money. Yet when she called me my hero, when she touched me, when I saw the look in her eyes, and when she kissed me, it didn't feel like a stunt for attention. It felt real, like there was a connection between us. After that, I fell asleep, feeling happy. I had my first real kiss, and I began to think that maybe someday I could have a life with a special woman. The next morning was Sunday, my day to sleep in, but by 7:30 my phone kept ringing. After the third buzz on my bedside table in just a few minutes, I picked up. "What?" I said, not even caring who was calling and waking me from a nice dream about a famous supermodel. "Bro, are you up?" My sister Harper's excited voice came through the phone. "Harper," I said, annoyed. "It's Sunday and it's only 7. I glanced at the clock. 33. Why are you calling me? "You're on every channel, Brian," Harper said, ignoring my irritation. "Turn on your TV." I groaned, but reached for the remote and turned on the TV. It showed one of those morning talk shows that discuss news and the latest gossip. This time, they kept showing a clip of me. Well, not just me, but the kiss Lorandra gave me. I turned up the sound. One of our top stories this morning. Yesterday was a big fundraising event for burn victims in Brisbane's new farm park. The event raised nearly $600,000 for medical equipment, much of which will help children. But the big question is, who is the man that international supermodel Lorandra stopped a whole fashion show for? The unidentified man was called up and kissed in front of nearly 2,000 people. This morning in entertainment news, we will explore Lorandra's rise to fame and try to uncover who this mysterious man is that she called my hero. In other news, I was shocked. I had never wanted the spotlight, and I had never met a supermodel before, let alone been noticed by someone so beautiful. "Brian, are you still there?" Harper asked. "Yeah," I replied absent-mindedly. She giggled. "Trey says you looked really cool in the clip," she teased, making me chuckle. "Well, I did get to kiss a really amazing woman," I said, smiling as I remembered her lips. "I think he's just a bit jealous that he only gets to kiss you." "Hey," she replied playfully. "I might not be a supermodel, but I know how to make my man happy." "Too much information, Harper," I chuckled. "Really too much." We chatted a bit more and wondered why Lorandra had noticed me in the crowd. Our conversation was interrupted when Mom and Dad joined me on a conference call to share some news. After another half hour in bed, I decided I wouldn't be getting any more sleep and got up. I spent a relaxed Sunday at home and even caught a few glances from my neighbors while mowing the front yard. For the first time, when they looked at me, I didn't look away. I smiled and waved, and they smiled back. Maybe it wasn't so bad to be noticed. On Monday, at work, we started a new public park project that Jeff had gotten approval for. The media had found me again, and soon I was surrounded by reporters with cameras as I got out of my truck. "Is it true that you're dating Lorandra?" one asked. "How long have you two been together?" another inquired. I felt stunned and just stood there for a moment. I instinctively started to pull my sleeves down to cover my arms. One reporter noticed and quickly asked, "How did you get your scars?" "Hey," Jeff called out as he got out of his truck and came over to me. "Leave Brian alone." "Mr. Webb," one reporter pressed, "how long have you known about the relationship between Mr. Other and Lurandra?" Jeff's expression turned serious. "Listen up, everyone," he said firmly. "What relationships Brian has or doesn't have are none of your business. He's a great worker, one of my best, and right now you're getting in the way. Unless you want to face complaints for bothering him, I suggest you leave and let us do our jobs." With that, Jeff took out his phone and snapped a picture of the group of reporters, making sure to capture their logos. He then led me back to his truck, giving a quick look at the reporters lingering around. "Just ignore them, Brian," he said. "They're just looking for a story, but they'll hopefully leave us alone. Are you all right?" I nodded and didn't say anything. Jeff smiled before walking away to let me focus on my work. While I felt normal over the weekend, the reporters' questions made me feel embarrassed and unworthy of their attention. In a matter of minutes, my confidence had vanished, and I couldn't understand why. The questions weren't overly harsh. Still, I felt like I wanted to hide. I spent the rest of the day focusing on the tasks at hand. The team seemed a bit careful around me. I could tell they wanted to ask about the weekend, but one look from Jeff made them hold back any questions. The video of me at work didn't make its way to the news like the first kiss did, but a few articles popped up online with photos of me at work and a close-up of the kiss. I usually try not to read comments about my life, but this time, I couldn't help myself. Some comments said, "It was just a publicity stunt," or "She's using him for attention." Others felt sorry for me, saying, "She's taking advantage of him." There were even comments on my scars, but many others defended me, which I appreciated. 2 weeks later, I went back to being just Brian, a big guy with scars and my usual self-doubt. But things changed a bit. On the second Friday after the event, I was invited to the pub after work, and I surprised everyone by saying yes. I wouldn't say it was the best night ever, but sitting with my coworkers, sharing laughs and drinks, was enjoyable. I noticed a lot of people staring at me. Maybe it was my appearance or because they recognized me. I heard a few whispers, but my friends bought me some beers and it kicked off a nice weekend. The next morning, I read a news article saying Lurandra was in New York and rumored to be dating an actor. Some comments said the actor wasn't even close to being as good as I was, the guy she kissed in the park. That made me smile. Since that event, my weekends changed. Now I spend most of my Saturday mornings at the hospital in the burns unit. After spending time with kids at the park, I realized that I had something important to share. Many of them needed someone to help them feel normal, find jobs, start relationships, and navigate life. They looked at me with my scars and saw someone who had been through a lot, but was still living a good life. It gave them hope. When I first visited after the event, everyone, doctors, parents, and kids, welcomed me warmly. My favorites quickly became Tim and Sonia. They spent a lot of time talking with me about their favorite things, especially the unicorn and lion, and a picture of Harper and me with them and the Wiggles. About a month later, I convinced Jeff to let me take the morning off. That day, Sonia was about to take her first steps without help. Everyone cheered when she made it across the small walkway of 5 steps. I felt so proud in that moment. After her walk, Sonia came to me for a big hug and kissed my cheek. Tim and Sonia might not be my children, but I had a special connection with them. I knew that wherever they went, we shared a bond now. I promised to always be there for them whenever they needed me. The next Saturday, almost 3 months since that day in the park, I was in the hospital cafeteria eating a barely edible muffin and sipping some terrible coffee before heading to the Burns unit to see Tim and Sonia when a woman sat down across from me. I looked up, surprised. I had to admire her boldness to sit down without asking after everything that had happened. At least she looked a bit shy. "Hey," she said after a moment. I wasn't sure what to say back. "Hi," I replied flatly. "What a surprise to see you here," she said, trying to start a conversation. I lifted my coffee cup, taking a sip of the bitter drink that was getting cooler by the second, and frowned at the cup. "Not really. You knew I would be here," I said. "That's true," she admitted. "I've just been waiting for the right moment to speak with you." I sighed, thinking about the ups and downs of the last few months, the growing friendship with Tim and Sonia, feeling more comfortable around others, and how my co-workers encouraged me to open up. I remembered that day in the park when everything changed, and then focused on the woman in front of me. I stood up, tossed the muffin and coffee cup in the trash, and walked out of the cafeteria towards the Burns unit, leaving her behind, surprised that I would just leave. "Brian, wait," she called out, following me. She started. "I thought we could talk about what happened. See if we could." "About what?" I interrupted, feeling angry and turning to look at her, ignoring the people around us. "Do you really think after everything I would welcome you back and say, 'It's all okay'? You didn't mean to hurt me?" "Is that what you expect?" I told her, noticing the worry on her face. "Well," she responded, "not exactly like that, but Brian, we could, I mean." "No," I interrupted, starting to walk away again. "Come on, Brian," she said, still following me. "Look at you. You're so much more confident now, and you're in public. You've even been on the news. What could it hurt?" "Ava," I said, turning back to her with anger, "you treat me badly when we were together, only using me for what I could give you. Then you went and got close to one of the few people I truly dislike. Why would I ever want to be around you again?" "Because who in this entire world would ever give a chance to someone like you but me?" she replied, then realized what she had just said and quickly covered her mouth. I stared at her for a moment. "Brian, I didn't mean," Ava said, her eyes wide. I stepped toward her, straightened up to my full height, brushed my hair off my face, and looked down at her. I felt proud of my scars, standing tall while I looked at her like she was something unappealing. "So what?" I said coldly. "Good old Brian Dumont got tired of you after he got what he wanted and then left you when it was over. You saw me get some attention on the news and thought maybe I would want you back. But I think you really meant what you said. Is that how you see me? Worse than what you are?" She looked away, showing shame, which confirmed my statement. "Just so you know, Ava, it's not that you're not slim that keeps people from wanting to date you," I told her, now with a softer tone. "It's that you can be difficult to be around." I continued. "Thanks to my experience in the park, I know that I have worth that goes beyond my scars. There are people who care about me, and someday I will meet a woman who sees the real me, not one who just settles because she's afraid of being alone." I took a moment to relax, as I noticed she looked like she was about to cry. "Look, Ava," I said gently, "there will never be anything between us again. You damaged that when you ended our relationship. I don't want to hate you. Just take care of yourself, stay away from people like Dumont, and next time you find someone interested in you, try to look beyond any flaws he has and show him that you can be a better person. Be a better person." She lowered her head and nodded sadly. I'm sorry, Brian. I really am. I'll try to do better." "That's all anyone can ask," I said, smiling at her, even though I didn't feel like it. We said our goodbyes, and Ava walked back slowly to the cafe, as if the world had weighed her down. Maybe something I said would help her. As for me, I felt both good and sad after our talk. I had never stood up for myself like that before, but hearing Ava's thoughts about wanting someone to care for me still made my heart hurt. A few minutes later, I arrived at the Burns unit. I put on a brave face and went inside to spend time with others who, like me, had to fight to be accepted despite their appearances. Not long after, I was sitting with Sonia and another girl, Megan. We were reading a story together when Sonia noticed I was down. "Mr. Bryan, are you okay?" she asked in her soft voice. Sonia was still in special bandages from her burns, but she could now move a little, which made everyone happy. "I'm fine, sweetie," I replied. "Why do you ask?" "Because you seem sad today," the wise little girl said. I realized that kids can see more than we think. Sonia could see through my efforts to appear happy. I leaned back on the couch, closed my eyes, and listened to the activity around us. I could hear kids playing with toys and games. Some were with their parents, friends, or nurses, while others sat quietly, dealing with their challenges. The mood in the room shifted between hope and sadness. Anyone who spent time here couldn't help but be affected by it. As I sat with Sonia and Megan, I took a moment to think about how to answer Sonia's question. When I opened my eyes, I smiled at my little friend, a fellow burn survivor who would face many of the same challenges I had. I promised myself to support her and her brother as much as I could in the future. "I guess you're right. Today I'm feeling a bit sad," I admitted. "But why, Mr. Bryan?" Megan asked, no longer focused on the book we were reading. "Because sometimes people can be unkind," I told the girls, and they nodded in understanding. On the way here today, someone who was unkind to me before tried to talk with me. Today, when I talked with her, she again used words that felt hurtful to me. "We don't look like other people," Sonia said wisely, then glanced to the side, distracted by someone sitting behind us. "No, we don't," I agreed. "But just because we look different doesn't mean it's fair for others to treat us as if we don't have feelings, dreams, and hopes like everyone else. Unlike others, we have to be braver because some might think they understand our struggles and feel sorry for us. But it's up to us to show them how to be better." I paused, trying to find the right words when a voice echoed in the room. "You need to show us how much you matter," the voice said, and I turned to see Lorandra. She was taking off a big straw hat and large sunglasses to reveal herself smiling at me. "Hello, Bryan," she said. Everyone in the room had stopped watching us. Sonia looked confused while Megan was bouncing with excitement. "It's her, Mr. Bryan. It's the woman who kissed you, Luata," Megan said, happily. "Lurandra," I corrected her, and then turned back to the supermodel. "Ms. Lurandra, may I ask what you're doing here?" She smiled, a bright smile that could light up the room. "Of course. I would be lying if I said I didn't come to talk to you," she told everyone, now paying attention. "But I also spend time visiting kids in hospitals around the world, so I thought I could do both today." I nodded, having taken an interest in her career since that day. She became famous about 8 years ago at the age of 17 and quickly became a well-known figure on the catwalk. Behind the scenes, she was known for being straightforward. While she attended parties, she was also recognized for staying away from the darker side of the industry, including drugs. Lorandra was tall and graceful, perhaps about 5 feet 7 inches. Even off the runway, she moved with a confidence that drew people's eyes. She had a warm smile and often brushed her long brown hair back over her shoulder. Fashion blogs frequently mentioned how her soft brown eyes seemed to show real compassion for everyone around her, something many models didn't have. She was always in high demand for shows in the US and Europe. At the same time, she generously donated her time to model for charity events, like the one a couple of months ago in New Farm Park. She was known for skipping many big events over the years to attend fundraisers, which made her even more popular in the high fashion world. Lurandra spent the next 3 hours with me as we played games with the kids. We laughed and smiled as we took turns reading stories and helping them build towers out of blocks. She even entertained the kids by showing them some simple magic tricks. Tim told me she was his favorite person in the world when she showed him how to make a coin disappear and reappear. During the afternoon, Lurandra noticed me looking around nervously a few times. On the third time, she asked what was wrong. "I'm just curious when the cameras will show up," I said, feeling a bit anxious but knowing it was likely to happen. Lurandra seemed a little upset. She pointed to an older woman in the corner. "See that woman?" she said. When I looked, the woman waved at me and smiled. "She is my agent, and she's the only one who can take any photos that may be shared publicly. No photos will happen without the approval of everyone in them." "Brian," she said, seriously as she looked at me, "I need to talk to you after this. There are some things I need to explain." I felt uneasy, but nodded. "Okay." Finally, we wrapped up our time with the kids. Lurandra hugged them and took a lot of photos with her agent. She also chatted with the adults. When it was time for her to take a picture with Tim and Sonia, they both insisted that I join them. I put on my best smile as her agent took several pictures. "Beautiful," the older woman said with a smile. "I'm Sandra," she said, offering her hand to me while Lurandra spent a few more minutes with the kids. "Brian," I replied, unsure what else to say. Sandra placed her hand on my shoulder in a friendly way. "I know," she said simply. "This isn't our first meeting." "It's not?" I asked, puzzled. She shook her head and smiled, but her smile seemed filled with sadness, a pain that was hard for me to understand. This woman seemed to carry a deep sadness, but hid it well, making it hard to recognize unless you had your own hurts. "I'll let Lurandra explain," she said softly. "After that, I would also like to talk with you." I nodded, completely confused about what she meant. About 20 minutes later, as the glamorous supermodel was saying her goodbyes and thanking the staff for their help, I said goodbye to the kids and waited outside of the Burns unit. "Thank you, Brian," Lurandra said as she left the room with Sandra beside her. "I didn't mean to surprise you, but I couldn't help it when I heard you talking about how people react to burns." I nodded, noticing that she didn't flinch at my appearance or treat me like I was different. She maintained strong eye contact, which made me feel a bit awkward at times while we spent time with the kids. She put on a big hat and some simple glasses. She explained that since it was getting dark, wearing sunglasses would draw just as much attention as not wearing the hat and glasses. Usually, the plain glasses, which weren't prescription, helped keep the reporters away long enough for us to move on. Sometimes she would still get recognized, but mostly it worked. "But walking with me makes it hard to blend in," I said. "That's true," she replied simply. We talked about various places to meet and finally decided she would come to my place for dinner. I shrugged and gave her the address. 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door, and I opened it to see Lurandra and Sandra standing there with shopping bags. After greeting them, I led them to the kitchen, and we started to unpack steaks, cheese, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, gourmet sauce, and ice cream for dessert. It was all pretty simple, and I couldn't help but laugh as we prepared dinner together. Sandra asked what was so funny. "I'm in my kitchen making dinner with a supermodel and her agent, and the model is eyeing the biggest steak like she wants it all to herself. I thought all supermodels only ate salad and air." Sandra laughed out loud while Lurandra blushed. Despite what people think, Lorandra said, we models do enjoy a good meal sometimes. A few minutes earlier, she had placed a large pan on the stove, and now it was hot with a bit of oil and garlic sizzling ready for the meat. She seasoned the 3 steaks with just some oil, salt, and pepper. Without saying anything else, she added the steaks to the pan. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, and she turned to look at me. I do need to keep an eye on my diet, though, she explained. I'll have to spend a bit more time in the gym this week before my next show, which is next month. But this is good food. And aside from the cheese, nothing is processed. So I want to enjoy a nice meal with someone I hope will be a good friend. I raised my eyebrow as she smiled warmly at me, and I responded, Sounds fair. The dinner conversation was light and friendly. Sandra said little, but she watched closely as Lorandra and I talked. Lorandra asked me about my job, my family, and even mentioned Harper by name, which caught me off guard. I shyly inquired about her travels, and she said that exploring the world had lost its charm for her. She explained that flying from place to place became more of a hassle than a pleasure. I nodded as if I understood, but honestly I didn't. I had never been on a plane. The way she talked about other cities made me feel a bit envious. I would have loved to see another city, but I never had the courage to book a trip, thinking they wouldn't allow me to fly because of my burn scars. After dinner, Sandra suggested we go to the lounge to chat while she cleaned up and made dessert. She gave Lorandra a bag and a friendly pat on the shoulder before heading to the kitchen. The 2 of us sat down awkwardly, and I was reminded of a scene from the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast, where Belle and the Beast were unsure how to start a conversation. Just like in the movie, it was the beautiful one who broke the silence. Betty, she said, placing an old backpack on the low table in front of her. I'm sorry, I responded. Nervously, she brushed her hair back over her shoulder. My real name is Betty, not Lorandra, she said with a small smile. I leaned back and nodded, saying her name softly. Would it be okay if I told you a story? She asked. In that moment, I could feel something in the air. It felt heavy and serious, like a storm was building. Strong emotions filled the space, even before she began her tale. Of course, I replied, swallowing as my throat suddenly felt dry. She nodded and started telling a story that seemed to change everything for us. When she was born, everyone was happy. She was the second child for her parents, and her big brother Theodore was a caring 4-year-old. He was old enough to help with small tasks like getting diapers or bringing bottles when their mother couldn't breastfeed. Betty was a charming baby with big brown eyes that would later become part of her signature look. As she started to notice her surroundings, the first person she recognized was Theo. Her parents were there too, but Theo always did silly things that made her laugh. When Betty learned to roll over, her mother told her how Theo would roll on the ground with her until it was time for a nap. When Betty was ready for solid foods, Theo enjoyed feeding her mashed apples and vegetables. He was the one who helped her take her first steps, while their parents watched with pride. He also helped put a Band-Aid onto her knee the first time she fell off her little tricycle and cried. Theo was the best big brother anyone could ask for, and no one could disagree. Their mom would share stories about him being a lively 6-year-old when Betty was 2. Sure, he got in some trouble for sneaking chocolate or avoiding his greens at dinner, but he loved Betty dearly. Everything changed with a fire. At that time, Betty was 4 years old, and Theo was 8, sleeping in a room across the hall from her. In the evenings, he filled her head with stories about school and how she would join him the next year to learn to count, spell, and read the bedtime stories they enjoyed with their parents. Betty was excited and often asked her parents when she could start school. But their happy family life shattered quickly. Their home caught fire because of their neighbor, who did not store dangerous chemicals properly. The flames spread rapidly from the neighbor's house to theirs before anyone realized what was happening. Betty's father woke up to the smoke alarm and broke their bedroom window to help his wife escape. He then ran to get Betty, carrying her through the smoky hallway where everything was dark. He handed her to her mother and, with a loving farewell, rushed back into the flames to look for Theo. Holding Betty tightly and with cuts on her arms from the glass, their mother cried out for her husband and son when the firefighters arrived, but it was too late for them to enter the building as both homes were heavily on fire and at risk of collapsing. For more than 30 minutes, the brave firefighters worked to control the blaze. Once it was safe enough, they entered the still warm remains of both homes. In the neighboring house, they found the body of the man who had mishandled the chemicals. In Betty's house, they searched for her father and brother. Her father, despite being badly hurt, had somehow helped young Theo into the shower and turned on the water, using his own body to protect the boy. Though their father had sadly passed away, Theo had miraculously survived. He was found holding on to life in the ruins of their home, protected by the water and his father's shield. However, Theo had suffered serious injuries. Theo, who brought joy to his little sister, fought to stay alive for almost 3 weeks. Like me, he stayed in a special tent, while Betty and their mother could only visit him for brief moments. He had many tubes and wires attached to him, and he tried not to cry whenever his little sister came to see him. At just 4 years old, Betty said she didn't remember many things, but she could recall how brave her big brother was. Over the years, their mother would share stories about Theo's strength and how proud she was of their father. One Tuesday afternoon felt like any other, but for Betty and her mother it was different as they visited Theo. Unbeknownst to Betty, the doctors had just told their mother that Theo was not going to survive. She held strong as they stood by Theo's side, while the doctors made changes to help ease his passing. "Hey," Theo whispered softly, his eyes bright as he looked at Betty. "Hey," Betty replied, as her mother knelt beside her and they both placed their hands on Theo's bandaged hands. "I need you to be brave, okay, Betty?" Theo said weakly. Betty nodded. "I am brave, Theo, and so are you." Theo gently shook his head. "I'm dying, Betty," he said, causing his mother to gasp. "It's all right, Mum. I've known for a few days. I heard the doctors talking to you." Betty started to cry. "No, no, no, Theo. You can't go. I need you. Mum and I need you," she cried out. Theo smiled at his mother and sister through the bandages. "It's okay, Betty, Mum. Dad says it won't hurt. I'll just go to sleep and won't wake up." "Dad?" Betty's head shot up as their mother gasped. "Warren," their mother whispered, the sadness in her voice making little Betty hold her mother's hand tightly. Theo gently urged his mother to come closer. "It's all right, Mom," he said. "Dad says he loves you and will be waiting for you, but it will be a while before you see him again." Betty's mother wept but nodded. She believed that her son was truly hearing from his father as he was preparing to leave this world. "Betty," Theo spoke again, his voice even weaker now. "Betty, this is very important, okay?" 4-year-old Betty stood up as tall as she could and took a small step forward, feeling deep down that this was the last moment she would have with her brother. "Always remember who you are. Be kind and friendly to everyone. Don't judge others or be rude," he told her. "You are going to do amazing things, my little sister. I know you will be strong. I love you, Betty. And Dad loves you too." With that, they said their goodbyes, and Theo closed his eyes for the last time. After leaving the isolation tent, Betty and her mom went to a common space where others with burns could meet their families. There were toys and coloring books, but today, Betty didn't feel like playing at all. Instead, they sat together for a long time, both crying. Her mom held her close, grieving for her husband and son, as tears streamed down her face while others moved around them, giving them space. They didn't know how to feel. The losses they had faced in recent weeks left them with a sense that the world had come to an end. They had lost everything. Their home had burned down. Their clothes were gone, and the men in their lives were no longer there. For the past 3 weeks, they had been sleeping on cots in a spare ward, watching over Theo. As tears stained her cheeks and her eyes hurt from crying, Betty sensed someone looking at her. It reminded her of a clear memory from today, the moments with her brother. A boy, just a year or two older than her, stood there, tears in his eyes, too. "He was brave," the boy said. "I spoke with Theo when he was lonely. He'll miss him." Holding on to her mother, Betty turned to look more closely at the boy and nodded. He was a long-term patient in the burns ward. Tall for his age, he was almost bald, with burns covering his face and arms and legs. Over the last few weeks, he had come to sit with Betty several times. They colored or did puzzles without much talk, just enjoying each other's company, knowing she needed a friend. Once, she had asked her mom about the boy. In a rare smile during those tough days, her mom had said he was a hero. She explained that almost a year ago, when the boy was just 5 years old, he had run into a burning house to save his little sister. He had been trapped, just like Theo had, protecting her like their dad had done for Theo. Fortunately, the firefighters had rescued them, and both the boy and his sister survived. Like Theo, the boy had spent many months in a clean tent while he received skin treatments to heal his injured skin. Her mother told Betty that the boy had just recently gotten his bandages off. He was spending time with other kids, telling them they would be okay, making jokes and helping them feel less alone. He often talked to Theo, standing outside Theo's tent, sharing silly conversations about sticks and funny noises, just the usual things kids talk about. Betty had never really spoken to the boy. She was worried about Theo and missed her dad. But after her mother shared stories about him, she felt different. Whenever he sat down to color or build blocks with her, she held his scarred hands. Like Theo, she thought of him as strong and brave, a hero for saving his sister. Just then, as Betty and her mom cried, the boy spoke about how brave Theo was. Now, just moments after losing Theo, the boy was there again. He, like Betty and her mother, had tears rolling down his cheeks for his lost friend and for the boy's family. As Betty sniffled, she saw the boy holding out a teddy bear. It looked like a treasured friend, worn and loved, much like the toys other kids in the hospital had. Through their tears, the boy offered this bear to Betty as a sign of comfort. Quietly, Betty got off her mom's lap and gently took the bear. Holding it tightly in her hands, she smiled even as new tears fell onto its soft fur. "Thank you," she whispered to the boy, and he nodded, feeling unsure of what to do next. She looked at him, someone who had faced his own tough battles and had shown nothing but kindness to her and her brother when they needed it most. Taking a few steps closer, she wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you," she said again, as their tears mingled together on them and the friendship bear. The next day, Betty and her mom went into a house that their insurance had arranged for them. She saw the boy one last time at Theo's and her dad's service. He was there with his sister, who had a scar on her arm. But the girl held on to the boy tightly, just as she would have clung to Theo, while their parents stood a little ways behind them. After the service, the boy's family approached Betty and her mother. His parents hugged him in a way that only parents who have faced difficult times with their children would understand. Betty hugged the boy's sister and then wrapped her arms around the boy, who smiled at her. "Is Barry helping?" he asked. "Barry is his name?" Betty replied with a gentle smile, taking out a toy bear from the backpack that someone had given her. "Yes, Barry the bear," the boy said. "He was with me when I was in pain. He's a great friend, and I know he'll help you." "Barry," she repeated, looking once more at the bear's stitched black eyes. "Thank you. I know your sister calls you her hero, but after everything you did for Theo, Mom, and me, I would like you to be my hero too," Betty said to the boy. He nodded in agreement. Soon, the boy and his family said their goodbyes, while Betty and her mother continued to greet those who came to offer their support. I sat there in shock, often wondering what had become of the little girl and her mother. I had spent hours talking to Theo, understanding how boring it could be in the tent. I wanted to be a friend to him. He was a few years older than me and loved skateboarding. I was fascinated by how he would ride with friends until dark, and how he could pop a wheelie on his bike. At that time, I admired his skills and had often thought about his family over the years. He was. I paused, feeling overwhelmed with emotion. Theo was so brave. I wished that if I faced something tough, I could be as brave as he was. Betty nodded, tears streaming down her face as she shared her story. She took out the backpack I now recognized and pulled out a worn toy bear with faded fur and one missing eye. Clearly very cherished over the years. Betty held it out, and with trembling hands I reached for it, knowing it was Barry, the toy I had given her long ago. But instead of handing it over, she threw her arms around me and cried. In that moment, it felt like we were both kids again, grieving for those we had lost as we shed tears together. From the doorway, Sandra also stood crying, touched by the reunion between Betty and me. Without letting go of Betty with my left arm, I reached out with my right. "Come here, Mrs. Brown," I said, finally realizing that Sandra was Betty's mother. For the next half hour, a mix of emotions filled my small living room. We shifted from sadness to joy, exchanging tears and laughter in equal measure. In front of me were not Laurandra and her agent anymore, but Betty and her mother, Sandra. I called Harper and told her I had just reconnected with Betty, and she needed to come over right away. 10 minutes later, Harper was shocked when she realized that Betty Brown was actually Laurandra. After that, it took another 20 minutes for the girls to exchange excited remarks before they settled down a bit. While Harper and Betty chatted, Trey, who was always with my sister, helped Sandra in the kitchen with ice cream and apple pie. They moved around my place quickly. When I tried to help, Betty playfully pushed me back down and sat on my lap, telling me I couldn't get up. Harper laughed and gave me a knowing smile. I was unsure of what to do. It seemed they both enjoyed my awkwardness, which was an understatement. Even with my time spent with Ava, I had never been this close to a woman. I sat there trying to stay still while Betty looked at me with bright eyes. After a moment, she returned to the conversation, causing me to blush. When everyone settled down with bowls of dessert, Betty was still sitting on my lap. She shared that not long after the funeral, she and Sandra moved to Melbourne to live with a cousin while they got back on their feet. They received a lot of support, and a couple of years later, Betty was invited to join a children's beauty pageant to help raise money for kids with cancer. At the pageant, a talent scout from a big modeling agency noticed Betty's walk and offered her a chance to join. By the time Betty was 12, she had a new name, Laurandra, which sounded exotic, and her modeling career began. Sandra and Betty were very close, so Sandra became her manager. Together, they traveled the world, attending charity events to raise money for good causes, while also ensuring Betty was recognized as a top model to give these charities attention. The five of us talked well into the evening, and when Betty noticed I was getting restless, she moved to the side of the couch but still held my hands, her legs resting on mine. Everyone in the room noticed that her hands were still with mine, and a few times I caught Harper looking at me with a grin. I playfully stuck my tongue out at her. With less than an hour before midnight, Harper and Trey decided to head home, and Sandra mentioned that she and Betty should do the same. Betty got up slowly, stretching like a cat, aware that everyone was watching her. I walked everyone to their cars. I kissed my sister and shook Trey's hand. "She likes you," Harper whispered to me as I kissed my little sister goodnight. I snorted, my expression saying, "No way." Harper just looked at me and wished us a good night. Sandra hugged me and thanked me for a wonderful evening and for being there for her son when he needed support. Then she told Betty and me to take a few minutes while she got the car ready. As she climbed into the shiny Audi, I almost rolled my eyes at the idea of it needing to warm up in our mild weather. But when Betty pulled me close, I kept my thoughts to myself. "Brian, she began, but paused. "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. She wrapped my arms around her and looked up at me. "You may not realize this, but for many years you have been my safe place. When I felt lost, I would think of how strong you were. You were my support during the hardest times. After Mom passed, you were the first person I turned to. You became the most important person in my life." I opened my mouth to argue, but she shook her head. "I know it was mostly in my mind, but you have always been there for me even from afar. I went to the charity event in New Farm Park to model and raise money for kids. I never expected to see you there. When I spotted you, I couldn't help myself. I called out to you and waved while walking down the runway. Brian, you have always been my hero." I gave her a small smile. She felt warm in my arms. The fact that this amazing woman was here with me, calling me her hero, made me feel on top of the world. "Brian," she said softly after a moment, both of us lost in our thoughts. Her tone told me she was about to ask something important. "I was wondering," she hesitated, stepping out of my embrace but still holding on to me. "I have a busy life. I travel for work a lot. And when I'm not, my mom and I try to fit in charity events." I nodded, knowing she had a lot going on, but I was confused about where this was heading. "Next weekend, I have a gala ball for the agency that represents several Australian models. I was hoping you would agree to go with me." "Me?" I replied, surprised. She nodded. I was still processing the idea. "Go with you?" I asked again. She nodded once more. "In public?" "Yes, Brian," she said, looking serious. "As a couple at the dinner." "But why, Betty?" I asked, still in disbelief. I felt out of place, like the odd one among a group of beautiful people. Betty seemed to notice my discomfort. "Yes, Brian, I mean you," she said firmly, taking my wrist. "I really want you to join me. Just so you know I like you." "Me?" I asked again, sounding a bit foolish. "But, Betty, you're a top model. I'm sure guys would happily pay just to spend time with you. You're on magazine covers and can have any guy you want." She gently placed her hand over my mouth, stopping my rambling. Before I realized what was happening, she pulled me down, and her lips met mine. It felt sweet, like apple pie and vanilla ice cream, and I couldn't believe how nice it was. "Betty," I said when she pulled away, "thank you. But why me? Everyone else will be so attractive. It'll just seem out of place." "No," she said, her voice firm now. "Brian, you don't see it because others have put you down. Many people love and care for you. Harper, Trey, your parents, Tim, Sonia, and Jeff, you aren't out of place. It might seem sudden, but Brian, you have been important to me for a long time. You're important, man? Betty, you've dated famous people and probably wealthy guys. I've only had one relationship in 26 years, and she left me for someone else before things got serious. So you've been waiting for me all this time, Betty said with a playful smile. You sly man. She leaned back into my arms. It's fine, Brian. I won't tell anyone. While you've been admiring me, I've been noticing you too. I'd like you to join me next week. If you feel uncomfortable at any moment, we can leave. But I want to spend time with you. I thought about it, spending time with an amazing woman who seemed to like me. That sounded easy. Okay, I agreed. She beamed at me and then we shared another kiss, this one lasting a bit longer. We only stopped when Sandra honked the horn. Betty laughed. Oops, I forgot my mom was here. Brian, can you call me in the morning? She asked, pulling out her phone. What's your number? I told her, and she quickly called my phone that I had left inside. That's my private number, only very close friends and family have it. Feeling a bit brave, I asked, which category do I fall into? I want you to be in the second category soon, she replied, stepping back. I have to go now, but please call me, or I'll be the one calling you. After she left, I walked back inside and sat down, picking up my phone. I saw a missed call from Betty and couldn't help but smile. I saved her number as Betty and noticed a text from my sister about 10 minutes ago while I was still outside with Betty. Well, it said, replied? Wow, that good. She sent back and then called me. We talked for about 15 minutes, then I said goodnight and went to bed. Just in case you might see it, I sent a message to Betty. Thinking about you, I texted. A moment later, I got a reply. Can't stop thinking about you too. You're my hero. But I need sleep. I promised to dream about us, okay? I replied and then fell asleep, remembering the best kiss I had ever received. I dared to hope someone might see me as more than just my scars. The following week, I texted and talked with Betty every day. Everyone at work guessed that I had met someone special. I got smiles and questions about who she was all week. I jokingly said, Lurandra, and they laughed, knowing it was a joke. They told me they were happy for me. I clocked off an hour early on Thursday, and Sandra and Betty picked me up from my place a little after 5. They took me to an upscale store and had me fitted for a tux. The owner seemed a bit rude until Betty told him to improve his attitude or she would stop working with him. After that, everything went well. On Saturday morning, Betty came to my place alone and said we were going for breakfast. Wearing hats and sunglasses, hers to hide her identity and mine to cover my scars, we drove to a seaside cafe and spent time talking about everything and nothing at all. What I loved about Betty was that she never asked for anything from me. She never expected me to treat her a certain way or buy her things, like Ava did. Instead, she treated me like I was just like everyone else. Although we got a few curious looks, most people moved on quickly if I glanced at them for more than a moment. For breakfast, I had 3 bacon and egg toasties and a large coffee, while Betty had a small coffee and an egg white omelet with spinach, which she barely touched. She blushed when I asked why she wasn't eating. I had a big meal with a guy I liked the other night, but I have a show coming up, so I have to watch what I eat, she said. But if you're still hungry... I finished the rest of her food. After we ate and talked some more, Betty and I drove to the hospital and spent a couple of hours with Tim and Sonia. Tim was excited to show us the Lego he had built throughout the day, while Sonia happily sat on my lap and held Betty's hand most of the time. Are you going to marry Ms. Lurandra? she asked me quietly at one point while Betty and Tim played with a few other kids. Nah, I'm going to wait until you get bigger and marry you, I told her, giving her a gentle tickle. Sonia giggled. No silly too young, she said. But if you marry Ms. Larandra, then you and she can adopt Tim and me and be our new parents. She said it so innocently that it made me stop and look at Betty. At that moment, she glanced over at us and smiled. However, her smile faltered for a moment when our eyes met, and she noticed the look on my face. Later, she asked me what was wrong, but I tried to brush it off. She wouldn't let it go. Brian, what's wrong? She asked. I thought we were having a nice day together? She was letting me drive her Audi back to my place, and I have to say, I was enjoying it. I had never driven anything that felt this smooth. I thought carefully before I answered. Betty, where do you see this going? I asked her. What do you mean, where? She replied quickly. I mean this, us, our relationship, I said, my voice a bit serious, but not too much. I'm not complaining. In the past week, I've spent time with a wonderful woman, and I've shared more kisses with you than I have with anyone in my whole life, even my mum. She laughed softly. But I'm still trying to understand this. You are amazing, and I feel so different. You travel everywhere and have so much, while I rarely leave town and have only a little saved up. We come from such different worlds. She held up her hand, and I stopped talking. After a moment, she sighed. Brian, I've told you that I like you, she said firmly. I know that you see yourself as less than others because of your scars. But you were there for me when I needed you. And despite my work, I can see the person you are inside. I was quiet, remembering my sister's similar words from months ago, focusing on the road ahead. A moment later, I felt her hand on my thigh, a gentle touch I hadn't expected. Betty spoke softly. Since the hospital, you've been the guy I wanted to be with. I don't care what you think you look like. I want to see if the man next to me could be the one I always dreamed about. I imagined dating him, falling in love, getting married, and having kids together. She said it so casually, but it surprised me. I swerved the car a bit before regaining control, and Betty giggled. Right now, I just hope you keep us safe on the road, she said, and I couldn't help but smile. Her words lifted the heavy mood. But Brian, I'm serious. I really like you, and I don't want to scare you by saying I feel even more than that. I have imagined all of this for years. If you are open to it, I would love to see if we could explore this together. I glanced at her, and her big brown eyes were so sweet. How could I say no? I just hoped it wouldn't lead to sadness later. I definitely want to say yes, Betty. Just thinking about being with someone as wonderful as you is beyond what I ever hoped for. I find it hard to believe that someone would actually want me, especially after all the times I faced rejection. I understand. I took a hand off the steering wheel and held hers. I sighed. I promise if you truly feel this way, I will work on not thinking of myself as strange, I said, my brow furrowed. I want to believe there is a chance for us, and I've really enjoyed our time together this past week. I let out another deep sigh, feeling Betty's hand squeeze mine. I sensed her concern. Please be gentle with me, Betty, I said. If at any time you feel I'm not the right person for you, please be honest and kind. We fell into a comfortable silence until we stopped at a traffic light just outside my house. Once the car was still, I felt Betty lean over and kiss my cheek. I will never hurt you, she whispered. We arrived at the event venue, and I almost stayed in the car, It was for a well-known modeling agency with a red carpet, barriers, and many reporters that made me want to drive away. Betty encouraged me to get out. "It's all right, Brian," she said kindly. She could tell I was nervous. "If we are together, they will see you. Think of it this way. It's just a short walk from the car to the door. We'll stop for a quick photo of my hand on your arm, then we can get inside where only the agency media is allowed. Come on, handsome." Even though I hesitated, her words caught me off guard. With a valet outside and reporters waiting, I paused at her compliment. "What's wrong, Brian?" she asked with concern. "You called me handsome," I replied softly, managing a small smile. Betty lit up. "Did I?" I wasn't really thinking. I decided I should get better at that. She patted my hand, gathered her bag, and nodded. I stepped out of the car, and for a moment the whole crowd seemed to hold their breath as the big man with scars got out of the fancy car and walked around to open the door for the famous supermodel, Lorandra. With Betty by my side, I tossed the keys to the surprised valet, and we made our way up the red carpet when the first question came from the amazed reporters. "Ms. Lorandra, is your date tonight Mr. Other?" one reporter asked as we turned to strike the first pose that Betty and I had practiced earlier. "Mr. Other," another reporter called to me. "Are you dating Lorandra?" We posed again. It was my first time trying to smile for a public photo. I remembered to relax, just like Betty and I had practiced. She was graceful, smiling easily, and used to posing like she had done many times before. I probably didn't look great, but she was doing wonderfully. I hoped I wouldn't appear too awkward in the photos when they got published. As the photographers clicked away and more questions came at us, we just smiled and stayed quiet. Then another car arrived, and Betty squeezed my arm, signaling it was time to walk inside. We moved smoothly toward the hotel doors, which 2 staff members opened for us. Once inside the elevator that would take us to the grand ballroom, I pressed the button while Betty stayed by my side. The doors opened, and we stepped inside together. Facing the front, Betty selected our floor, and the doors closed, leaving just the 2 of us. "Wow," I said as the doors shut. "How do you do this all the time, especially in front of all those cameras during events?" Instead of answering right away, she turned to me, gently pulled my face down, and gave me a kiss. "I'm proud of you," she said, letting her hand linger on my face and gently tracing the scar on my cheek. "I know that wasn't easy, but you did a great job. I'm really happy to have such an amazing man with me." I felt my cheeks warm at her praise. I wasn't used to compliments like that. Betty's gaze held mine, and I could see the warmth and admiration in her eyes. Wait a minute. Admiration. I was starting to think about what those feelings meant when the elevator slowed and the doors opened to the hallway leading into the grand ballroom. What I saw as the doors opened looked like something out of a movie. The hallway was rich in color with dark browns and deep reds, along with light tan highlights. Each door we walked past appeared to be made of dark oak or some other beautiful high-quality wood. The wallpaper had a fancy design that looked like it was made with gold. The lights were arranged to show off the artwork and signs pointing to different rooms. I could hear classical music and was surprised to see an older woman of Asian descent playing a grand piano. Her long brown hair fell in waves, and she wore a flowing green dress as she played. As we walked along, Betty calmly told me what to expect. She reassured me not to worry about how others might react, saying she would be with me every step of the way. When we entered the ballroom, it took my breath away. The agency clearly spent a lot more money than needed. 2 rows of 3 beautiful chandeliers hung from the ceiling in the large room. On one side, there was a big dance floor, and at both ends, there were large ice sculptures. To our right, a statue of a swan had its neck arched and wings spread wide. At the other end, a sculpture of a model struck a pose as if she were on a runway looking out at the crowd. Later that evening, I noticed that the ice statue looked a lot like Betty. Right in front of us was a large stage where a string quartet was playing music that matched the pianist outside. To my right, there were round tables covered with red silk tablecloths and white cloth placements, sparkling silverware, and bottles of champagne wrapped with white flowers. Many people were chatting in small groups. I was surprised to see both beautiful models and many ordinary-looking people, some of whom weren't very attractive. As I took in the scene, we had only been in the room for about 10 seconds when we heard a loud shout. At first I thought someone might have spotted me. A high-pitched female voice seemed to be aimed at me, not out of fear, but excitement. "Lurandra!" A woman in a deep blue dress with long blonde hair shouted, rushing toward us. I vaguely recognized her from my research on Betty. She was another model. She ran up and hugged Betty, who finally let go of my arm. "Cassandra," Betty said with a big smile. "How are you, my dear?" "Good, good," Cassandra replied casually, suddenly looking at me. Her gaze narrowed as she inspected my face, then moved over my body. Her eyes widened, and a smile formed as she turned back to Betty, giving her a hug. "You found him?" she said, and Betty nodded. Cassandra then turned to me as Betty slipped her arm back into mine. Cassandra reached out her gentle hand. "Cassandra Blaine," she said formally, offering a small arm. I took her hand carefully, not wanting to grip too tightly as we exchanged a handshake. I was worried that if I squeezed too hard, I might hurt her. "Brian Other," I replied. "Yes, that's right," she said with a curious look. "Betty? Oh, sorry. Lurandra here has been looking for you for years. I swear she talks about you all the time." I glanced between the two women, and I noticed Betty blush as Cassandra winked at me. Then, to my surprise, she linked her arm with mine and guided Betty and me around. For the next 40 minutes, I met many important people models, their agents, TV stars, news presenters, and even a few athletes. Knowing I was feeling nervous, Betty stayed close to me, which I appreciated. I was thankful when Cassandra came by 3 times, bringing us glasses of wine and taking away the empty ones. I hadn't even realized Betty's mother had entered the room. Betty and I sat at a table towards the front of the ballroom near the stage. Our table included Cassandra and her date, another model named Brad, along with a member of Parliament for Brisbane and her wife. Waiters moved around, taking orders from a planned menu. For my main dish, I chose a Wagyu steak, cooked medium rare with pepper sauce, smashed potatoes, and a variety of seasonal vegetables. I ordered a red wine that Betty suggested. Betty opted for a chicken salad and a glass of white wine. When the food arrived, I was surprised by the portion size. The meat was thick and tender. My jaw must have dropped because the TV news presenter sitting next to me noticed my reaction. "It's always a surprise the first time," he said. "You'd think with this being an event for models, the meals would be small." I nodded, and he chuckled as he cut into his steak. "The models might barely touch their food, but the rest of us are paying for a good meal." I looked over at him, and he smiled again before putting down his knife and fork and extending his hand. "Ray," he introduced himself. "Ray Jordan, Frontline News." I shook his hand, recognizing him from his long career as a presenter. "Brian Other," I responded. Again, he greeted me with a friendly smile. "I think most people in the city know who you are." "Brian," he said, as a few others at the table smiled politely. I felt a bit uneasy, and he leaned back, trying to seem friendly. "Don't worry about it, mate," he said in an Australian accent that surprised me. Here. There's no media or stories to share unless you want to. Tonight we are just people together supporting a good cause. A good cause? I asked, feeling a bit tense. Betty hadn't mentioned anything about donations. Ray must have seen my sudden worry. Don't worry, Brian. It's all supported by donations and the charity auction, he said, pointing to a brochure on the table. They hold a great event every year, and this time they are helping homeless shelters. I nodded, and then I noticed Betty smiling and agreeing with him. I found that Ray and his wife Joanne were easy to talk to. They were both used to being around people and treated me like I was just another guest. After dinner, they held the charity auction amid a few speeches and award presentations. My lovely date won the award for her great work in the community, smiling at me as she accepted it amidst polite applause. Ray kept talking to me after we met, and we enjoyed discussing the items for the auction. I learned that he and Joanne had 3 daughters, all in private school, and this was a rare night out for them where he didn't have to be the news anchor. Everyone knew. I noticed Cassandra and Brad moving between the tables, but Cassandra kept returning to where Betty and I were. It felt like Betty would usually be socializing with others, and she was staying close to me. She playfully scolded me when I mentioned it. Brian, I am right where I want to be tonight, by your side, she said. The only time I'll leave your side is for the restroom, and I'm watching what I drink, so that won't be necessary. Then, my date took my hand and leaned in to kiss me on the cheek. I heard a joyful sound and looked over to see Joanne watching us, her hands clasped over her heart. I hate to gossip, she said, even though it didn't sound convincing as Betty leaned against my shoulder. But did you really just meet at the new farm park event a couple of months ago? I gave Betty an encouraging squeeze. Not quite, Betty explained. Brian and I first met when I was 4 years old in the hospital's burns unit. For the next 10 minutes, we took turns sharing a shorter, less emotional version of our story. By the end, everyone at the table seemed thoughtful, some even dabbing their eyes with their napkins. Even Cassandra and Brad took a moment to listen to our story. Well, Joanne said when we finished, if there's ever a couple I want to see succeed in this world, it's you two. Everyone around the table agreed, and I looked at Betty. Couple? I asked her quietly as the MC stood up to grab everyone's attention. Betty nodded and squeezed my arm warmly as the MC spoke about the agency's successes over the past year. I hardly noticed what Betty said next. I really like that, Brian. I know we're moving quickly, but I enjoy the idea of us being together. Before long, it was time to dance, and I found myself in new and unfamiliar territory. I had never danced before, except in the privacy of my home. Even at school, I avoided dancing because the other kids didn't want to be near me because of my scars. When one teacher offered to dance, I politely said no, feeling sad about the rejection I faced from my classmates. Betty was patient and helped me learn the basic steps. I wouldn't say I danced elegantly, but I was happy that I didn't embarrass myself. After a few songs, Cassandra joined in, taking Betty to dance with someone else. Betty assured me she wouldn't be far away. I nodded and smiled at Cassandra, my new partner. You're special, you know that, right? Cassandra asked right after we began dancing. Like Betty, she led because I had no idea what to do. Me? I replied, surprised. Yes, you, she laughed, and then looked at Betty, who was watching us closely. She really likes you, and now that I've met you, I see why. I chuckled softly. Someone has hurt you, haven't they, Brian? Cassandra said, getting right to the point. We danced for a while, and I nodded. Most people see me and think I'm just a big guy with ugly scars. They don't usually react well. We danced a little more, mostly just swaying together. No, it's deeper than that. Someone has really hurt you. And more than once, she observed, noticing my shift in expression. I could tell you thought of that person when I mentioned it because your eyes changed for a moment. I nodded again. Don't let that person stay in your mind to keep hurting you, Cassandra encouraged, squeezing my hand gently. Her hand was small in mine, but her message was clear. Since the event at New Farm Park, Betty can't stop talking about you, she said. Look at her. She's always smiling now. For us models, we either force a smile or adopt a serious look. I nodded, listening carefully. Betty's biggest charm has always been her eyes. When she smiles with her eyes, it makes the world feel a little brighter. I looked over at Betty, who was still dancing with Brad and glancing my way. Our eyes met, and we smiled at each other. Cassandra noticed this connection. But when she looks at you, Brian, it's like her smile lights up the room. She often appears on magazine covers and does commercials that showcase her bright spirit. But if the agents see her smile when she looks at you, her value will go up. Because of me? I said, surprised. Yes, because of you, she said clearly. I think she has been drawn to you since she was a child. I feel like there's a but coming, I said, pausing for a moment. Of course, Cassandra responded, smiling, but her smile didn't seem real this time. She sees the perfect guy in you, Brian. You are honest and work hard. You give even when others don't treat you well. You put yourself out there, even when it's hard. I think you care about my friend more than you realize. I felt myself blush. But, she smiled, you need to trust yourself as much as Betty trusts you. If you do, neither of you will get hurt. If you don't, both of you might be unhappy. We danced a bit longer as I thought about her words until the song ended. Then we turned to Betty and Brad, getting ready to switch partners again. Thank you for the dance, Brian, Cassandra said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. She then leaned in closer and whispered, Think about what I said. You'll see I was right. What was that about? Betty asked, as we walked back to the table. I just mean I better treat her well, or she might come after me for real, I joked. Don't doubt it, Cassandra called out from a few steps behind us as she laughed. I could see Betty was going to ask me something serious when we were stopped before we could sit down. Lorandra, called a thin man with a high voice. Andrew, Betty replied, her face lighting up with a real smile. How are you, dear? He asked, kissing her on both cheeks. Then he looked at me. Well, well, aren't you just the whole package? So handsome. Betty laughed. Brian, meet Andrew Phillip, the most fun fashion reporter you'll ever come across, she said, as we shook hands. He had a strong grip for a guy. Andrew, this is my date for the night, Brian Other. He looked me up and down, clearly sizing me up. Yes, you are quite charming, he said, still looking at me. Very charming. Then he turned his attention back to Betty. Lorandra, darling, he said in a way that made the people around us smirk. I guessed they knew him well. Would you and your date be willing to have a quick interview? Betty looked at me, and her smile faded a bit. She gave me a slight nod. Earlier, she had mentioned that a few reporters would be around, but she would only let us be interviewed by those she trusted to tell our story in a good way. It seemed like Andrew was one of them. I nodded back, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness in my stomach. Sounds good, Andrew. Is now a good time for you? She asked, knowing that if she waited, I might hesitate. Absolutely. Just perfect, he replied. Follow me." We walked into another hallway where there were 4 soundproof recording rooms lined up. I could see through the clear walls that 2 were already in use. In one, 2 people were talking, likely having a one-on-one interview. In another, there were 4 people. 3 were standing, and it seemed like they were singing. I guess they might be a local teen band that was somewhat known. Andrew, Betty, and I entered the room at the end, and Andrew closed the door behind us. Betty and I settled onto one of the couches, while Andrew took a seat on the other one. "Wow," he said, sounding relieved. "It's nice to sit down and take a break for a bit. How are you, Betty?" I was surprised by how much his demeanor changed from a lively fashion reporter to an everyday Australian guy. "Did I miss something?" I asked after a moment. Andrew laughed and clapped his knees. Betty jumped in. "Brian, Andrew and I have known each other for years. He's just putting on a show." "A show?" I asked, looking at Andrew. "So you're not gay?" Andrew chuckled. "Definitely not. I'm happily married with 3 kids." He pulled out his phone to show me a picture of his lovely wife and their 3 kids, who were between 8 and 15 years old. "I've noticed that if I act a little differently at these events and fashion shows, I can negotiate better. Everyone everywhere knows the truth, but being a bit over the top can open doors for me." He used the playful tone again, and I couldn't help but smile. We chatted for a few more minutes, and he explained what we were going to do. He assured us that nothing would be shared without our permission and asked if Sandra could represent both of us. Betty and I agreed, and he started recording. "So," Andrew said in a serious tone, "I can sense the connection between you 2. Brian, you and Lorandra have been talked about in the fashion world since the New Farm Park event. Too bad I missed it. But you're here tonight. Lorandra, you look absolutely stunning, and Brian, you look very sharp too. I bet half the people here, including some of the guys, are a bit jealous of Lorandra tonight." He said it with such enthusiasm that I started to believe it a little. "So, is there something going on between you 2, Brian and Lorandra?" he asked. We glanced at each other, and without thinking, our hands reached for one another. "I think there might be," I said, taking the lead for the first time. Andrew clapped his hands excitedly. "Great job. Now, Brian," Andrew said, lowering his voice a bit, "even though this is just audio, I think everyone has seen the pictures of you and Lorandra from New Farm Park. You have some scars on your body. Would you be willing to share a little about them?" For the next 15 minutes, I talked about my burns and how they happened. I described my time in the hospital, and Andrew gently encouraged me to share my experiences with bullying while making sure it didn't feel too heavy. He also asked about my relationships. I looked down and admitted that I had never really had one. Whenever I liked a girl, she either said yes and then hurt me, or left after a few dates, making me feel like I didn't fit in. Andrew paused the recording and apologized, saying he wouldn't include that part because he could tell it was tough for me. I smiled and told him it was okay. I hoped that maybe other kids could learn from my experiences and that some of the girls I liked in the past would understand how they had treated me. When he restarted the tape, he invited Betty to share her story about losing her brother. She spoke about how we met as children and how we had reconnected after New Farm Park, exploring the possibility of more. Throughout the process, Andrew maintained his lively personality but was careful not to push too hard. Whenever he sensed it might be too much, we paused to talk about it. Finally, Andrew asked about the New Farm Park event and the kiss that started everything. I had been searching for Brian for a long time. I even hired investigators, but he was hard to find. After moving back to Brisbane, I hoped I could finally see him, Betty explained. When I spotted him in the crowd, I knew it was him, and without thinking, I stopped. Well, she shrugged. Everyone saw what happened next. Andrew smiled and asked, "Do you have any regrets about it?" "None," Betty said, and I nodded in agreement, smiling too. Well, there you have it, folks. Our own fairy tale unfolding. Thank you, Brian and Lorandra. As we left the booth, Andrew shook my hand and hugged Betty, reminding her to look after me. Later that evening, Betty dropped me off at home and arranged a date for the following Friday night, along with many texts and calls during the week. I also received a sweet kiss that left me smiling for days. The next day, I was surprised when I got a copy of the article for review. After a call with Sandra, I agreed to have it published. It was released in the fashion media with the title, Aussie Fairy Tale, and the opening line of Lorandra and the most real man I have ever met. Most of the guys on the crew were joking around, saying things like, "You're kidding me, Lorandra," and "You're messing with us, Brian, a supermodel?" It was like that at the work site. But what really made me feel good was that none of them made me feel awkward about having a relationship. The next 2 months were amazing. I can't remember being this happy before. Betty and I spent a lot of time together. She had to go overseas for a show twice and flew to Sydney 3 times for work. But when she wasn't working, she always made time for me. She showed me the lovely apartment she shared with Sandra. But we often spent time at my place because it felt more private. I felt like a teenager again, spending hours just hugging her and holding her close. I introduced Betty and Sandra to my parents. My mom hugged them both and had tears of joy. She welcomed them to our family. We had cookouts, watched movies, enjoyed picnics, and visited art galleries. I even got to experience my first plane ride to Sydney to attend a show with Betty. I was nervous during takeoff and landing, but Betty held my hand. I felt a bit embarrassed, but she said it was cute. In Sydney, we shared a bed, and for the first time I held someone while we fell asleep. I had never slept so well as I did that night. In the morning, I woke up to see Betty looking at me. "Good morning, my man," she said, kissing me. I smiled back. "Please, tell me this is real, that you're really here," I said, reaching out to touch her face. "It's real. Very real," she answered as she sat up. Betty was wearing a soft nightgown, and she looked at me with a curious expression. "Brian, why haven't you tried to be closer to me yet?" she asked, sounding a bit vulnerable. "Closer? What do you mean?" I started to respond, but then I realized where this was going. I quickly sat up and noticed she saw my scars for the first time in the morning light. Her eyes widened as she looked at the marks on my chest. "Brian? She gasped, covering her mouth and glancing between my body and my face. It's one thing to see someone's face and arms. It's different when you see more of their scars. I smiled gently. "It's okay, Betty. It doesn't hurt. Look." I took her hand and placed it on my chest. "See?" After a moment, I smiled softly, got up from the bed, pulled on a shirt, and sat in the corner of the room. "Don't be upset. It's okay, Betty," I said. "Most people get shocked when they see me without a shirt on. It took this long for you to see the real me." "Well, I guess now you can let me go," I said quietly. "No," she replied, stepping off the bed and into my arms, her embrace filled with warmth. "No," she repeated, searching my eyes. "Brian, I'm not walking away just because I saw your scars. If anything, they make me see you even more clearly. You felt safe enough to show me a part of you, and that means something. Those marks, they're just part of you. And I admire you all the more for it." Her gaze was steady as she held on to me. "You're not losing me. You're mine. Understand?" We shared another kiss, and when we paused, I smiled, gently touching her cheek. "Sorry, I'm just so used to expecting the worst," I admitted, our foreheads meeting as we stayed close. "Did I hear you say you're falling in love with me?" She nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Yes, Brian. I'm falling in love with you. And I know you care about me, too." She hesitated, looking thoughtful. "So why are we holding back?" I glanced away, feeling a bit vulnerable. "It's complicated." "Are you nervous?" she asked, looking at me closely. "Yeah," I admitted. "I've never been in a real relationship before, not like this. Well, you're someone the world knows, an international model. I'm just not sure how I fit into your life." She smiled gently. "Brian, I care about who you are, not how the world sees me." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, and she leaned in again, her eyes full of sincerity. "Listen," she said, holding my gaze. "What we have is different from anything I've felt before. I don't care about anyone else, just you." She paused, thinking over her words. "What matters is that we're here together, and I know this is special." She brushed her hand through my hair and smiled, filled with a calm confidence that reassured me. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up as I noticed her excitement. She looked at me and then back at her own fluttering breath as she stood up quickly. "Brian," she said seriously, "I want you to know that right now, there's nothing I want more than for us to be together." "I feel a but coming," I replied, trying to hold back my urge to act. She nodded. "I long for it, but I want our first time to be special," she replied, struggling with her feelings. "I want it to mean something. Right now, we need to get ready for the day and fly home. If we do it now, it would be too quick. I want our first time to be something wonderful. Does that make sense?" For some reason, I agreed. She smiled and took a few steps back. "Okay, just give me a minute. I wish I could invite you to join me in the shower, like I thought we would this morning, but just wait a bit, then you can rinse off." I sighed and nodded. "And Brian?" she called back to me. I turned to see her in the bathroom doorway, and she casually took off her nightgown. She was stunning, standing there with nothing on, just a beaming smile. I gripped the chair tightly and felt a rush. She looked beautiful, with smooth skin and an amazing figure. When she turned to glance at me, I couldn't help but notice her graceful form. It was clear why she was a model. "Give me a minute, sweetie," she said playfully, knowing I was watching her closely. "Then the shower will be all yours." It only took me 30 seconds in the shower to feel a sense of relief. Her encouragement from outside didn't make it easier. When I finished and got dressed, she greeted me with a kiss. "Thank you, Brian. I know many would have given in to temptation. I promise it will be worth it. We have today. Then I will be in Paris for a week. After that, I'll have a month here with you, and I want us to enjoy that time together." Throughout the day, as we explored Sydney, holding hands and sharing small kisses, I found myself thinking about her words often. On the 8th day of her trip to Paris, the idea of us together began to feel distant. I was counting down the days until she was back, excited about the possibility of sharing meaningful moments. After nearly 30 years, I hoped to find someone who truly cared for me, someone who could say they loved me and share a deep connection. Yes, it sounds romantic, but that was what I wanted. I didn't want to lose something precious to a careless moment or a night I'd later regret. I wanted someone to care about me for who I was. With Betty, I felt like I'd finally found that person. After we got back from our trip to Sydney, Betty gave me a long, heartfelt kiss. She reminded me she had to leave early for Paris the next day, but promised that when she returned, she'd make sure I knew how lucky I was. We chatted over Messenger during those first few days. I stayed up late, adjusting to the time difference, and it was worth it. Betty was excited, and even showed me the view from her hotel room, hinting that someday she'd love for me to come along with her. I also talked with Cassandra, who was working at the same event. Betty kept sending me photos of her and Cassandra together, full of smiles and hugs, with little messages like, "Wish you were here." I sent her photos in return, me and the guys at work, goofing around with our shovels and wheelbarrows. I even sent a short video of myself driving a small digger, showing off a bit. It was lighthearted and fun. But on the fifth night, Betty apologized and told me the main event was starting. For the next few days, she wouldn't be able to talk as much since the show would keep her busy. She'd still text, but things would be hectic. I understood and told her I'd try to catch the event online if I could. She had given me a login and password so I could watch it live. It felt a little unusual for a guy like me to be watching us at the Fashion Session So, don't know whatever style, but when I showed up at girlfriend, it's my best on the road there. I watched one room when he can never feel as amazed about eased. She wore elegant evening gowns, beach wear, and even some unique outfits like trench coats. It was all part of her world, and I felt lucky knowing I was the one who got to be close to her. The guys at work gave me a hard time, joking about me watching fashion shows, but it was all in good fun. For once, I felt like part of the group, not just the odd one out. With everything going so well, my future with Betty, the hope of building something real with her. I sat down that evening, ready to watch her next show online. I was excited, knowing the event was almost over and she'd soon be heading home. I watched Cassandra first, stunning in a red evening gown with sparkling sequins. Then I saw Betty step onto the runway, poised and graceful, ready to make her walk. She was just moments away from walking in a beautiful white dress that looked shiny like silk, wearing long gloves. Then my phone buzzed with a message. With just about a minute left, I picked it up and saw it was from an unknown number. "Hey, you should read these articles about your girlfriend before you get too serious with her. Just thought you should know." The message had a link, and if I had been wise, I would have checked it out first. But I clicked on it, and I regretted it immediately. The first article had several pictures showing Laurandra in Paris with two attractive men. She looked happy, and the article questioned her loyalty to her boyfriend, Brian, back in Australia. The next picture showed her in a compromising situation with one of the men, who had his hands on her inappropriately, with a caption asking, "What about Brian?" The second article focused on her ex-boyfriend, Tommy Williams, with pictures of them together. It suggested that once Laurandra was done with her current relationship, she would reunite with Tommy and they might even get married soon. I turned back to the live stream, watching as Betty walked down the catwalk. She looked serious, but also captivating. Now I couldn't help but wonder if her charm was meant for me or for Tommy. I felt crushed. After everything we had been through, I thought Betty and I shared something special. I believed we were falling for each other, but now I felt like just another pawn in her game. The idea hurt and made me angry. But wait, those were just news articles, speculation and not facts. I decided to reply as I watched her make her return. "Sorry, I don't know how you got this number, but these are just made-up stories. You've got it wrong." Moments later, I received a series of messages and images that shattered my heart. "Sorry, Crispy, but it's too late. I've already enjoyed Paris." It was from Brian Dumont. 4 images followed. The first one was of Dumont in a backstage dressing room, taking a selfie, smiling, and giving a thumbs up. In the background, Betty waved at the camera. The second showed Brian and Betty close together, both grinning like they were best friends. The third picture was Dumont taking a selfie while Betty stood beside him, dressed minimally. I felt my chest tighten as anger rose. The last image broke me completely. It was taken in a hotel room. Out the window, I could see the Eiffel Tower, which reminded me of where I was. In the bottom right corner of my phone screen, I noticed the date stamp was only 2 hours after last night's show. That was when Betty sent me a text saying she was tired and going to sleep. But in the photo she sent, she was very much awake. In the picture, she was fully exposed, smiling in a way that lit up her eyes, just like when she was walking the runway and looking at me in Sydney only 2 weeks earlier. Next to her was Brian Dumont, also smiling at the camera, making it clear he felt like he had won once again. I don't know how long I stared at the images. It felt like only a moment, but it could have been much longer. Eventually, I found myself sitting on the bench in my backyard, watching the last of the sunset and unsure how I had gotten there. The sky was darkening with storm clouds, and the air smelled fresh. But as the sun set and the stars began to appear, I enjoyed the cool breeze. I rested my arms on the bench and leaned back to gaze at the sky as the first raindrops hit the ground. That night, a strong storm rolled in. Lightning flashed, and the wind howled. I hardly noticed it as I sat there feeling sorry for myself. The bright flashes of lightning lit up the sky, and the loud thunder didn't bother me at all. Instead, my thoughts replayed moments of my life that brought me down. I remembered saving Harper, my time in the hospital, being turned down by Ava, and the moments spent with Tim and Sonia. But the sting from Brian Dumont lingered the longest. He seemed to ruin every happy memory I had. His smirk haunted me again and again, pushing me deeper into my thoughts as the storm raged on outside, matching my inner turmoil. And then there was Betty Brown, the famous model who stole my heart. I truly believed she cared for me and loved me. But then Dumont came along and took her away. With my eyes closed, I tried to block out everything around me. The image of Betty tormented me. She was once my source of confidence, but then became a reminder of lost hope. Her beauty was striking, but it was her smile and the memory of our shared moments that would stay with me forever. I sank even deeper into my thoughts, unable to escape the lingering memory of her kisses, despite the pain they now caused me. Betty might not be with me anymore, but I would always carry the memories of our time together. The warmth of her lips against mine spoke of dreams and what could have been. Tears mixed with the rain on my face, and I shivered from both sadness and the chilly air around me. I sighed, my voice lost in the storm, knowing that her affection was now for someone else. Once again, my happiness had seemed to vanish. Why? Because I shared a name with him, and he found joy in making me feel this way. But this time, I was determined not to let him win. I was confident because even as the storm faded, the wind continued to blow. It was likely early morning. As I sat on the bench, the cold was settling in. The wind chilled me, and I felt my usual strength slipping away. I didn't mind staying here, but I also didn't oppose the idea of nature taking me somewhere safe, where I wouldn't get hurt anymore. As I trembled now, not just from sadness, but from the chill, I thought about Harper. What if I hadn't rushed into that danger? I might have felt normal, but I would have lost my sister. No. If I had the chance again, I would still run in to save her. She was worth every risk. Harper would be upset if I left. I knew she would be very angry. She would miss me more than anyone else. In my life, there had been no better supporter than my little sister. For a short time, I thought Betty could match that. But I realized I was wrong. Harper would probably let Betty know how she felt when she learned what had happened, but mostly she would feel sad. My parents and Trey would also be upset, though perhaps not as much as Harper. They had always been there for me when I needed them. Jeff, my boss, was great, and my co-workers too. Maybe there were a few people who would be sad if I were gone. Now I felt a deep cold. My body had stopped shaking, and I knew that was a bad sign. I briefly wondered if I might get really sick, but it was unlikely. However, the earlier storm and the cold wind could still take a toll on me. I thought of Betty again. Even if she had moved on, would she miss me? I remembered our time in Sydney, believing we could have a future together. But the photos told a different story, especially that last one. She might have felt something for me, but no one takes those kinds of pictures unless they are with someone special. Clearly, I was not that person. For a moment, the image of her and someone else faded, and I could only see her smile and her eyes. Suddenly, I felt a rush of warmth. My heartbeat quickened, and I sensed the life flowing through me, igniting a feeling that was not just from the cold. From our first real meeting a few months ago in the Burns unit, I hoped we could find love. I thought of Tim and Sonia. The twins would be hurt that I was gone. They were two kids facing the world together just like me, and would have to deal with the same unfairness I had. If I was going to make it, it would be for them. This thought gave me a little strength, and I realized I was being foolish. Sitting here feeling so low didn't mean I could give up on being there for Tim and Sonia as they grew up. They would face the same struggles that I had, and they needed someone to help them through it. Without their parents, that someone had to be me. I tried to move, but I found I had no energy. My arms felt numb and wouldn't follow my commands. I attempted to move my legs, but they felt just as unresponsive. I thought I could feel my toes move, but that might have been my imagination. In a panic, I tried to twist my body, but I was still stuck. My arms were locked over the bench. My muscles had tightened, pulling blood away from my arms and legs to keep my core stable and alive. Instead of moving, I just managed to push a few splinters into my arms, shifting only a little bit. I scolded myself for letting my sadness keep me from being there for Tim and Sonia. I stopped and tried to listen to the world around me, hoping to find a way to escape this situation. Inside, I could hear my phone ringing. It had probably been ringing for the past hour, but I hadn't really noticed it. I figured it was likely Betty calling to end things, but I was okay with that. I would have a hole in my heart that might never be filled. Yet I realized that Tim and Sonia would need me, and that was what mattered most right now. I focused and began to hear more sounds. In the distance, a garbage truck was moving, which meant it must be close to dawn. Dawn suggested warmth, and if I could just hold on until then, I might be able to move and get help. But a sudden chill in the air made me doubt my strength. I could feel it on my skin, but I also felt numb, like the cold was muffling everything. Worse, I started to feel very tired, and I knew falling asleep was the last thing I should do. Through half-closed eyes that were blurry and unfocused, I saw a light on the horizon. I could hear a car stop and someone knocking on a neighbor's door. For a moment, I wondered who would knock at this early hour. But then it hit me that they might be able to call for help, and I tried to shout out. However, my voice was weak from the cold and my exhaustion. I managed to speak, but my voice was very soft, not loud enough to get anyone's attention. I felt weak and was fighting to stay awake when I thought I heard my back door open. "What happened, Brian?" Harper said, sounding upset when she saw me. "Betty is worried because you haven't answered her messages and she—" Harper suddenly stopped talking when she noticed I wasn't moving on the bench. "Brian?" she asked, coming closer. "Brian!" she yelled. "Oh no, Brian, what happened? Help!" I heard her scrambling, and then she spoke into her phone. "Betty, I found him. He's out back, and it looks like he has been here all night. He's wet from the rain, his lips are purple, and he's freezing. Betty." "No, you're right. Call an ambulance," I heard Harper say in a panic before she made another call. She talked to someone who said help was on the way. They must have told her to stay calm and talk to me while waiting. "Brian, what happened? Why did you stay outside? What's wrong?" she asked, using the word hero, which made me groan. "Dumont," I whispered as she got close. Harper's face quickly changed to worry as she asked, "What did you say? Did Dumont do this?" "He took Betty," I managed to say. Harper would find my phone and see the truth about what Dumont had done to me. She kissed my forehead and frowned. "Brian, that can't be true. Betty would never do that to you," she said as her warm lips touched my cold skin just as the ambulance arrived. There was silence between us as Harper shouted that we were outside. Suddenly, many hands were touching me and a soft voice told me to relax. They asked questions, and I whispered responses, though I couldn't remember what I said. They wrapped me in a blanket, and I finally gave in to the exhaustion and blacked out. When I woke up slowly, I learned it had been 4 days since Harper found me. I was in a hospital room, and somehow, Betty was next to me. The bed was larger than normal, probably for bigger patients like me. Betty was close to me, lightly snoring as I started to come around, but that changed as I groaned from the aches and pains all over my body. Betty woke up immediately. "Brian, are you okay?" she asked, panic flooding her voice. "Betty, why are you here? What about Dumont?" I asked weakly. I could see anger growing in Betty's eyes, and her voice had a harsh tone that surprised me. "That man can suffer for all I care," she said fiercely. I looked at her, confused. I had seen the articles and photos. "What?" I said hoarsely, my throat hurting. "Betty, I saw everything. The photos." "I don't understand. What are you doing here?" "Shh," she said, leaning in to give me a soft kiss. "Brian, it was all lies. I was never with him, and I'm pretty upset with you right now, to be honest." Upset with me? What did I do? I asked the tense woman who was holding on to me tightly. Her anger, which was directed at someone else, was now aimed at me. "Brian, why would you stay out in the rain during a storm? The doctors said if Harper hadn't arrived when she did, you might have died. Your body was shutting down. Why did you do that?" Betty then broke down and cried on my chest. I felt confused but wrapped my arm around her to comfort her. At least I could move again, which was a relief. After a minute, she looked at me with a question in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Betty," I said sadly, still unsure why she was here. Maybe it was pity. "I never really told you about my past with Brian Dumont. I suppose Harper filled you in?" She nodded. "Yes, let's just say I never want to be on your sister's bad side again." "Why not?" I asked. Betty looked away, a bit embarrassed. "While they were getting you into the ambulance, I called Harper to see what was happening. She told me you were in serious condition from being out in the cold." I nodded. "While Harper was securing your house before going to the hospital, she found your phone. It still had a certain picture open." She glanced at me, her cheeks flushed. I looked away, feeling ashamed. Here she was expressing her care for me and calling it lies. Yet she had been with Dumont. I had seen the photograph. "Brian," she said, gently grabbing my attention. "Look at me." Her hand turned my face back towards hers. I saw tears in her eyes. "The photo isn't real. It's a fake. Experts call it a deep fake. Dumont took a picture of himself with someone who looked a bit like me and then used computer skills to add my face to that image." As I watched her cry, my heart softened. "It was not me." She emphasized each word, still in tears. I realized I was crying too. I felt relief knowing that Betty hadn't been involved with Dumont, but I needed to know more. "What about the articles and the other pictures?" "I had Andrew check those articles," she said, tears still streaming down her cheeks, making her look so sweet. "They are also fake. Dumont tried to remove them, but Harper had Andrew look at your phone, and they found the data. But the other photos..." She sighed again. "Brian, those photos are real, but they're taken out of context. I've told you about Tommy. I don't know how he got those photos of Tommy and me. They were taken at a private event a few years ago." I nodded, not needing to hear more at that moment. "What about the ones in Paris?" I asked. "Aside from the one that wasn't good, those were real," Betty explained, now blushing. "Brian, you know when we model, most of the time we walk around backstage in very little clothing." I nodded. Betty had told me before. There was nothing inappropriate about it. The models, both men and women, usually wore minimal clothing as they quickly changed. I didn't like it, but I understood it was part of the modeling world. Somehow, Dumont got a backstage pass and took a picture of me during a quick change. There should be an assistant present, and it happens very fast, but somehow he got in and took the picture. He's in big trouble for that alone, not to mention everything else. She sighed. "Brian, the other picture's the selfie with me waving and us cheek to cheek. He introduced himself and said he knew you, showing me some pictures of you both from school to prove it. He said he was going to send them to you to say hi. I thought he was being honest, so I allowed it." I understood, but I still felt misled. "Brian, I get it," she said, her hand now in mine. "Right now you might feel like I betrayed you. You might think I was just using you, or that I was going to leave with Tommy or Dumont." I felt my face heat up. "Yeah, pretty much." She leaned in and kissed me. "I understand, Brian, I really do. Because of one kind choice, you've faced teasing and shame from the world and from Dumont more than others. But Brian..." I looked at her. "You have me. I've joined Harper in the Hero Brian fan club. I love you, Brian, deeply, and no one but you will ever have my heart. When you get out of here, though, I'm upset you've changed my plans. You will have the chance to love me in every way. I am yours, and no one else's. I want to marry you, to build a life with you, to laugh and cry together, to get frustrated with you for not remembering something from the store, or just to hold you when you feel down. Your past is nothing negative to me, Brian. It shows me the kind of person you are, a man who rescued his sister, a friend who helped my brother when he needed it, and someone who comforted me with his kindness. Let me be there for you, Brian. Please don't push me away or leave me." In the soft morning light, after her heartfelt words, we stayed quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said simply. "Really?" she asked, tilting her head in surprise. "Yes. I'll marry you," I replied with a smile. Betty's eyes widened and filled with tears as she leaned into me, sobbing softly. "What's happening here?" My sister's playful voice broke the moment a few minutes later. She held 2 coffees, one for her and one for Betty. "We're getting married," Betty exclaimed, tears still streaming down her face. What do you mean married? Trey asked, standing behind Harper and sipping his coffee. And by the way, it's good to see you awake, Brian. Come on, Harper said, giving him a playful punch. He just woke up after a tough time and that's what you ask? He smiled. Yep, I know him. It takes more than one tough night to keep him down. I mean, he fought through all of it, which brought me to you, didn't it? Harper softened. Oh, she said, giving Trey a quick kiss, then playfully punching him again. Still, he almost didn't make it. She turned to us, setting down the coffees and placing her hands on her hips. And what's this about getting married? Brian, did you just ask Betty to marry you? Nope, I said, smiling at the mix of surprise and joy on my sister's face. She just asked me. Harper looked back and forth between us for a moment before she squealed in delight. She tried to give me a hug, but Betty held onto my hand tightly and wouldn't shift from my lap. Trey walked around the bed, and we shared a fist bump. Bro, was all he said. Harper dashed off and returned a few minutes later with Tim and Sonia. Apparently, they had visited me yesterday while I was still asleep, and were happy to see me awake. Tim was his usual excited self, and Sonia, with her hair starting to grow back, looked much healthier. Like me, she would always have scars, but her skin had improved over the years and looked better than before. Betty helped Sonia onto my bed, and I was soon holding Betty in one arm and Sonia in the other, while Trey and Tim played tic-tac-toe on a travel game board. Sonia showed me her new doll, made from different pieces of cloth and wearing overalls with "I need hugs" written on the front. It was a gift from one of her mother's relatives who came to visit. She felt sad because the lady was quite old and lived far away, so she and Tim couldn't go live with her. I told her it would be okay because no matter where they ended up, Betty and I would always be there for them. I know, Mr. Brian, she replied. You know? I said, tapping the tip of her nose, making her giggle. Yep, she said, moving the doll's arms up and down. And how do you know that? Betty asked, leaning back against me and gently touching Sonia's cheek. Because Mom and Dad told me, she said matter-of-factly. Your Mom and Dad told you? Betty asked curiously. Yeah, Sonia explained. The night of the big storm a few days ago. Mom and Dad told me in a dream that Mr. Brian and Mrs. Betty would take care of Tim and me. I glanced at Betty. It was interesting how Sonia said Mrs. but neither child knew what had happened earlier with the proposal. Sonia had always called her Ms. Larandra before. Sonia started humming happily, tracing the scars on the back of my hand while holding her doll close to her chest. A few hours later, my parents arrived, and there were hugs all around. They greeted everyone, including Tim and Sonia, and I noticed Mom giving something to Betty out of the corner of my eye. My brow furrowed, until a few minutes later, as I was sitting up, Betty sat on the side of my hospital bed and opened a small box in front of everyone. Brian, I know our journey has been unusual, full of ups and downs. You have been there for me in tough times, and now I want to be there for you when things seem hard. When I look at you, I don't just see a man who has faced challenges. I see a strong man fighting through difficulties. I see a kind man who gives of himself, even when it is tough. I see a wonderful and steady man that I have completely fallen in love with. Brian, my love, my heart, my soul. Your mother gave me this ring, her mother's engagement ring, as a symbol of our love, unchanging and formed by life's trials. She paused and smiled. Would you do me the honor of taking this ring and agreeing to be my husband? I looked around the room and saw everyone's expressions. Everyone was smiling and waiting for me to say yes. I frowned. I can only say yes on one condition, I said quietly. Everyone held their breath. What condition is that? Betty asked in a whisper. She wasn't too worried. I had said yes before, but we hadn't talked about any conditions. My condition is that as part of our marriage, I said seriously, these two wonderful children here need a home. They come as part of the deal if we marry. Betty's face lit up with a big smile, and both of us looked at Sonia, then Tim. They didn't seem to quite understand what we were talking about. Did you hear that? Harper said, turning to Sonia. My brother will only marry Betty if you and Tim agree to live with them. Sonia inhaled deeply, her eyes wide as she looked at Tim. Then she turned back to us, her face bright with joy. You mean if Tim and I come and live with you, we can be a family? She asked, her voice growing higher with excitement. That's right, I said. We can be a family, but only if you both say yes. Yes, 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 shouted the little girl, thrilled. Tim just smiled and said a quiet, yes. I then turned to Betty, took the ring from the box, and placed it on her finger. Yes, I will marry you, Betty Brown. Everyone clapped as I pulled Betty close and kissed her gently. We spent the rest of the afternoon chatting. Betty, Harper, and my mother talked about wedding plans and brought in the hospital staff to discuss adopting Tim and Sonia. Later in the afternoon, I was cleared from the hospital with instructions to take a week off, which Betty quickly arranged with a phone call to Jeff. That night, as I climbed into bed, I was not surprised to see Betty enter the room, wearing a simple white shirt and smiling softly. She pulled back the sheets and climbed in next to me, raising an eyebrow as she noticed me watching her. You will be able to keep your hands to yourself tonight, won't you? She asked with a serious expression. Remember, the doctor said to take it easy. I swallowed and nodded. Are you? Betty laughed softly. Honestly, right now I want to be close to you. But I want you to be ready for it. I don't want you back in the hospital because of me. Her tone shifted from serious to playful. I opened my arms, and without thinking, she cuddled into me. Suddenly, our lips met, and I was amazed by how natural it felt to be with her. I felt her hands wander. She caressed my arms and touched my face as we kissed. After a moment, she pulled back, holding my face and looking into my eyes. I love you, Brian, she said. And I love you, Betty, I replied. After a little while, we paused and reflected. Betty, I said softly. I know, she replied. Just hold me as we fall asleep, please. I want to feel your arms around me. I smiled as she nestled closer, feeling comfortable and happy. She giggled softly. I know you care about me, she whispered, settling against me. Soon. Very soon. She was right. I wanted nothing more than to be close to her, but I knew I could wait a little longer. As I fell asleep with my arm around her for the first time, I didn't dream of past troubles. Instead, I dreamed of warmth, love, and a family, with Tim and Sonia along with our own future children. In the morning, I woke up to find Betty already awake. She lay there, and when I opened my eyes, she smiled and touched my cheek. Hi, she said. Hi, I replied, looking back at her. Betty, please tell me this is real. I never thought I would find someone who loves me, someone who accepts me. She leaned in and kissed me. It's real, my love, she said softly. And she paused. What is it? I asked, suddenly more alert. Brian, I was wondering if you'd let me do something for you. I grinned at her. Something fun? Betty shook her head, blushed a bit, and then nodded sideways. No, not really, but it involves some touch. I propped myself up on my elbow, feeling warm from being so close to her all night. What do you want? You know I would do anything for you. She glanced at the bedside table behind me and then back at me. I noticed my alarm clock and saw it was only 7:30 in the morning. We have all day, I said. Other than visiting the kids, Is there anything else we have to do today? She nodded. I wasn't really looking at the time. I had a dream last night, and I was wondering if you would let me act it out. A dream? I asked, my smile returning. She nodded and got up, walking around the bed. I admired her as she picked up a bottle of lotion from the far edge of my bedside table. If you don't mind, she said shyly, I'd like to rub this on your back. As someone who had suffered burns, my skin needed regular care to stay healthy. If I didn't take care of it, my skin became red and irritated. I often went to the doctor for this, and part of my routine was applying lotion to keep my skin moisturized. I could usually manage my face and arms easily, but my back was harder to reach without a special tool. I was glad that my fiancé wanted to help me with this. I swallowed and nodded. I would like that, I told her, feeling a bit nervous. The smile she gave me was bright, like she had just finished a big fashion show and was beaming at everyone in the audience. We took a few minutes to get ready, taking care of our morning needs, and I grabbed some towels from the hall closet to place on the bed. I took off my shirt while Betty watched, and I noticed a mix of emotions on her face when she saw the scars on my back for the first time. In Sydney, she had mostly seen my chest. My back, however, was marked in a way that was much more noticeable. I let her look, no longer worried about being turned away. I knew she loved me, and I was quiet. Brian, would you be okay if I touched you? She asked gently, a bit nervous. I nodded. If it's your touch. A moment later, I felt her soft hands on my back. She traced the lines and scars, exploring each part. I was surprised when I felt the first gentle kiss on my back. Betty was kissing the parts I usually hid from everyone. But now, I felt I could trust her. After a little while, she asked me to lie face down on the bed. I lay down, positioning myself comfortably. I felt Betty sit next to me and heard her open the moisturizer. Her first touch was light and gentle, so I encouraged her to be a little firmer. For the next several minutes, her hands moved over my back, my shoulders, and my arms as she rubbed in the cream. It felt nice to have someone help soothe the areas I couldn't easily reach. Then, she moved to my lower back. I have some scars there, though not as many as on the rest of my body. Lift your hips, please, she said. I did, not realizing what she would do next. Before I knew it, she had my shorts down to my knees. Very nice, Betty said, and before I could say anything, she guided me back down onto the bed and continued to massage my lower back. Relax. I know this feels strange, but I want to help us get closer, she said, trying to calm my nerves. I want to learn every part of who you are. As she said this, I felt her lean over and kiss my lower back. I care about you. Please let me show you, she said gently. In that moment, I felt her kiss my left side, then my right. Underneath me, I could feel my excitement growing. I was about to turn when I felt Betty closely beside me. We had spent weeks getting to know each other, sharing kisses and moments. But this time felt different. She positioned herself next to me, and I could feel her warmth against my skin. As she lay down, I felt her pressing against me. Her arms wrapped around mine, and then she kissed my neck, which made me shiver with delight. We stayed like that for a while, her body on mine, and I could sense a connection growing between us. Her kisses became deeper as time passed. This is amazing, she said happily. It's my dream to be close to you like this and show you how much I care. I'm not bothering you, am I? I laughed softly. No, it feels new, but it's nice. I feel warm and cherished. She moved on to her hands and knees. Roll over. I want to be beside you and look into your eyes. I turned over and felt a rush as I saw her up close again. Betty smiled, noticing my reaction. She leaned down and kissed me quickly while supporting herself on her hands and knees. "Do you like what you see?" she asked playfully. The question surprised me. Here I was, in bed with someone others considered incredibly attractive. She was admired by people everywhere, and yet she seemed unsure about how I felt. "You are by far," I said, reaching out to touch her cheek, "the most beautiful person I have ever shared a moment with." She giggled at my words and settled down beside me, playfully nudging me. "You charmer," she replied, blushing as she lightly tapped my chest. "I'm sure you say that to everyone," she teased, a playful smile in her eyes. I laughed, feeling a bit nervous, but happy. She looked at me warmly, a hint of fun and confidence on her face. "Are you surprised?" she asked with a grin, her eyes full of excitement. I was speechless for a moment, taken aback by her energy and kindness. She tilted her head, her gaze softening as she looked at me. "You really care, don't you?" she said quietly, reaching over to hold my hand. "You make me feel seen and special, and I don't take that lightly." I nodded, feeling a surge of warmth. "I do care," I replied, looking into her eyes. She gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Then let's take this one step at a time. There's no rush. No need to be anything but ourselves here," she said softly, her smile reassuring. The moment felt right, filled with the kind of trust and comfort I hadn't expected. We sat there in silence for a while, content just being close, knowing that whatever we shared was genuine and special. Brian couldn't believe this was happening. He felt nervous yet joyful, looking at Betty with awe and gratitude. She held his hand, and they both shared a deep, silent moment, feeling a closeness he hadn't experienced before. They lay together, both knowing they were sharing something genuine and meaningful. Betty looked at him, her eyes full of warmth. "You make me feel special, Brian," she said softly. He held her closer, his heart pounding, and smiled. They spent the morning simply enjoying each other's company, talking, laughing, and letting the time pass peacefully. Their connection was deepening, and it felt natural and right. Brian felt like he was finally where he was meant to be, with someone who truly understood and valued him. In that quiet, shared moment, they both knew this was a love built on mutual respect and trust, a foundation they could build a future on. "Let's have a baby together." Hearing those words stirred something deep in me, surpassing any pleasure I had felt before. As we relaxed, Betty kept her head close to mine. "Did I do okay?" I asked, my voice a bit shaky. Betty laughed softly. "Brian, you were more than okay. It was amazing. Did you feel how I was around you?" Her words sounded sweet and a little playful, and I enjoyed how she talked about our connection. "Yes, it was incredible," I responded. I shifted away slightly, and she curled up next to me, resting her head on my chest, as her finger traced one of my chest scars. "Brian, that was the first time I've ever felt that way with someone," she said. I paused to think about it. She had mentioned before that she had been with other people, but she also said I would be her only one now. That made me smile. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," I told her simply. She looked up at me and smiled. "You're welcome. Just so you know, Brian, you're mine now," she said. "I have been since that first kiss," I replied, and she returned my smile. "But I want you to know that I am yours too. No one else will ever share this with me, and if someone tries, I won't let them," she said. "I feel the same way," I replied, a slight growl in my voice. She laughed. happy as we enjoyed the moment together. I want to be the first for you, and there are some things I'd like to explore. Like what? I asked, holding her close. Betty turned a bit red. Well, one thing people talk about is trying new things, she said, laughing a bit as I shifted. I've never felt ready before, but I'd like to try with you, and I hope we can keep it between us. I thought it over and nodded. What else? I'd like to try being tied up and blindfolded, she said. I noticed her change in mood slightly. Got it, I said. What about your wishes? She asked me. I took a moment to think, unsure, but she pushed me to be honest. Well, I've thought it would be fun to share sushi in a different way, I said, remembering a show I saw once. She giggled and then turned serious. Have you ever thought about a wild night? I haven't really, but I know of some. No, I interrupted. Just drinks with you any day sounds good, but nothing that could harm us. I've seen the impact. She squeezed my hand. Me too. We're on the same page about that. We spent some time talking about what we liked and didn't like, and I learned that her past experiences were quite simple. She explained that she hadn't found someone she truly loved and trusted until now. She wanted to explore new possibilities, but only with someone who would treat her kindly. After about an hour and a half, we finally got out of bed, showered, dressed, and went to the hospital to visit Tim and Sonia. They were so happy to see us, and we began talking about family life. We spent most of the day together, and Sonia was especially excited about being able to leave the hospital soon without needing a nurse. I had a feeling it wouldn't be long before she went home, and we hoped they could join Betty and me in our place. Later, we were in Betty's car on our way to Harper and Trey's for dinner, when Betty turned to me with that familiar tone. Brian, she said, the kind of tone that indicates she might ask something important. Yeah, I answered carefully. I hoped it wasn't anything too serious, since we had enjoyed our time together earlier. I was wondering, when we get married, where will we live? She asked. I hadn't really thought about it. My house was nice, but it had only 2 bedrooms. That meant Tim and Sonia would need to share a room, which was fine for now. But in a few years, as they entered their teenage years, that could become an issue. Betty had a 3-bedroom apartment in the city, but one room was taken by Sandra, which didn't give us much privacy either. I hadn't thought about that, I said after a moment. I don't think either of our places will work long term. Is that what you're getting at? Betty nodded as we drove through the neighborhood. I think we need to find a new place, she said. I suppose, I agreed. Selling my house could take some time, and I wouldn't want to ask your mom to move out. Betty laughed softly. No, we wouldn't want to do that. Sandra was still in Paris, fixing things with the event organizers about Betty leaving early. They agreed Betty could attend the next show for free, and she was also dealing with issues involving Brian Dumont, who had caused some trouble. Since Dumont was from France and classified as a French citizen, he faced some serious consequences. He would likely be held until he could meet with a judge, or he could be released on bail. But he would have to give up his passport and could not return to Australia. I was thinking, Betty said, looking out the window as we passed other houses. We could search for a nice big place with 4 or 5 bedrooms, open living, something that feels like home for a family. Can we afford that? I asked. I know you're worth a bit more than me, but in this good area near Tim and Sonia's school, that must be worth over $1 million, right? Brian, my dear, my fiancé said softly, just a day after our engagement. How much do you think him worth? I thought back to the websites I had browsed after our first kiss. I shrugged. I'm not sure, I replied. I'm not in love with you for your money, maybe 7 or 8 million? She laughed. You were looking at Wikipedia, weren't you? I felt my face turn red as we turned a corner. Babe, my personal wealth is closer to $80 million, and most of that has been made in the last 3 years. A lot of it is tied up in various investments, but in a few weeks we could buy a house without a mortgage in that range. My eyes widened. I had no idea, I said. Hey, she said, sensing my surprise. If I was worried about you wanting my money, I would have brought it up before now. Like professional athletes, models have a short time at the top. As we get older, younger faces replace us. I grinned. You will always be beautiful. Thanks, babe, she said, placing her hand on my leg as we stopped at a red light. I know you'll always see me that way. And while I will always have my appeal, think of how Cindy Crawford aged. I know my popularity will fade over time. While we're successful, we make as much money as we can, then let smart people help us invest so we can be comfortable for life. The light turned green. That makes sense, I replied. Besides, don't you think it would be nice for us to give Tim and Sonia a brother or sister in a few years? I looked at the amazing woman beside me, her smile bright and her eyes shining with excitement as we pulled into Harper and Trey's driveway. I think I would like that, I said thoughtfully, turning off the car. The next few months were busy. Betty managed to work from various studios in the city, only needing to travel 3 times over 2 months, and those were just day trips. Sandra came home not long after our drive, having seen the proposal on video. She insisted that Betty and I sit down with her and explain everything from finding me unresponsive outside my place to Betty's proposal to my wish that we work on adopting Tim and Sonia. The thought of becoming a grandmother and having 2 kids to care for filled Sandra with excitement. As Lorandra, Betty's agent, she had many connections around the world that helped her get things done. By the end of her first week back, she had finished legal paperwork that would allow Betty and me to take care of Tim and Sonia when they were released in about a month. We also talked about buying a new house. Together with my parents, Harper and Trey, everyone helped Betty and me find a good home. We discovered a lovely 5-bedroom house in the northern suburbs. It had a decent-sized yard and was positioned on a hill with views of the city. The house was fairly new, built by a young lawyer who wanted to start a family. Sadly, he and his wife separated, and now they were selling the house as part of their divorce. The rooms were spacious, and the master bedroom felt almost as big as my old house. It had a nice walk-in closet for Betty's clothes and a large double shower that I was eager to try. There was also a big garage for 3 cars, complete with a workshop for my things, and I immediately loved the back deck with its wonderful views. We spent almost a week moving our belongings and buying furniture, making sure the rooms for Tim and Sonia were ready. We decided to move in on the same day they would officially come to live with us. While they knew most of this, seeing it all in person was different. I have some great video of us bringing the kids in and their joyful shouts as they saw their new home and their own rooms. Sonia especially wanted hugs and happily placed her toy unicorn on her princess bed. For the first time, I felt comfortable walking around in shirts that showed my scars. Tim felt the same way, and Sonia wore pretty dresses. If they could be brave and show their marks, then I could too as their guardian. Betty and I talked about getting married in about 6 months, early in the new year when it would be warm in Australia. We didn't want to wait too long, as this would also be around the time we hoped to finalize the adoption of Tim and Sonia, making us a real family. There were some rumors about Lorandra and me, so Betty and I decided to ask Andrew to come and do a formal interview with us. Andrew wanted to take a family portrait including Tim and Sonia. We sought advice to ensure it was okay to include the kids in the interview since we weren't their legal parents yet. We were told that as long as government officials could review the interview before it was released, there shouldn't be any problems. For the first time ever, I felt like an ordinary person. I smiled at people in public and was even happy to talk about my scars when someone asked. At night, after I put the kids to bed, Betty and I would enjoy each other's company in our king-size bed. We talked a lot and often held hands. We also liked to sit together on the back deck with a drink in the early evening. I felt happy and ready to start my new life with my wife and the two kids I was proud to call my son and daughter. Just a few weeks before the wedding, everything changed. I had my right hand in a bucket of ice, the water tinted red with a little of my blood. My hand hurt, but a checkup had shown it wasn't broken, just sprained. I sat back in the police interview room, using a napkin to gently dab my split lip. After sitting for about half an hour, trying to ignore the dull decorations, a detective came in with a folder. He placed it down and sat across from me before opening it and reading. Mr. Brian Other, recently turned 28. Works as a landscaper for Big Landscapes, current legal guardian of twins Tim and Sonia Redding, engaged to Betty Brown. He frowned at her name while looking at a photo of her. Better known as the model Lorandra, I spoke up, making the connection clear. His surprise was evident for a moment before he regained his professional stance. Well, yes, of course, Lorandra. Then he paused and looked at me with a hint of disbelief. Really? Lorandra? He asked. I chuckled. Yes, I'm engaged to Lorandra, also known as Betty Brown, one of the most beautiful women in the world. He cleared his throat, his voice a bit shaky. Really, I mean. I raised an eyebrow. A few months ago, his reaction would have made me anxious, but I felt different now. Is there something wrong with me? A reason I shouldn't be with her? I sensed what he wanted to say, but he held back. I laughed again. Is it because I am a large, awkward person? I enjoyed his discomfort. When he began to respond, I waved him off. Detective, it's fine. I know that when the media catches wind of this, there will be a lot of talk about me and Betty. But yes, I am engaged to her. He smiled and seemed to relax. I'm sorry, Mr. Other, he said. Brian, I replied. Brian, he repeated, nodding. Well, Brian, we have a bit of a problem here. Can you walk me through it? Am I under arrest or facing any charges? I asked, trying to see if I needed a lawyer. Not right now, the detective replied, shaking his head. Everyone is here, and we're interviewing each person separately. It's possible there could be charges, but it depends on what everyone says. What about Tim and Sonia? I asked. They're being watched by. He paused as he looked at his notes. Ms. Harper Other. Your sister? I nodded, feeling relieved that the kids were safe. Can you tell me what happened this afternoon? He asked, putting a recorder on the table. Is that okay? I nodded. I'd rather keep it casual and off the record. I'm willing to share what happened, but if you want to record it, I would have to talk more formally and I'd prefer to keep it friendly. He leaned back and looked at me for a moment. Okay, casual for now. So, Brian, what happened? He put the recorder away, and I took a deep breath to gather my thoughts. Since that important day in New Farm Park, my life had changed a lot. I was no longer defined by the sadness from the scars on my body, scars I got from saving my sister from a fire when I was younger. Indeed, after meeting Betty Brown, better known to the world as Lorandra, the supermodel, I began to open up. We were engaged, and we were also in the process of adopting twins. They were two wonderful kids who, like me, had been burned in a house fire where they lost their family. Tim and Sonia would be our legal children once Betty and I got married in a few weeks. Since Betty was famous, we had been meeting with a trusted reporter named Andrew, who would interview all of us over the next few days to prepare for the announcements regarding our marriage and the adoptions. I had experienced some media attention before when Lurandra kissed me in front of many people, but that had calmed down, leaving only a buzz about our relationship. People knew she was dating me, but they wouldn't realize how serious it was until Andrew's articles came out. Betty kept her engagement ring in a box on the dresser in our bedroom, except when we were at home. It was a bright Saturday morning. Betty had gone to the airport to pick up Andrew, while Tim, Sonia, and I sat up at a table in a quiet corner of the lovely gardens in New Farm Park. We knew this was the right spot for the interview because it was where everything had begun. After getting comfortable and sitting down, Tim and Sonia excitedly shared their plans as a family. They talked about trips to the beach, visits to Disneyland, friends they wanted to see, pets they hoped to get, movies they wanted to watch, and what kinds of chocolate and candy should always be in the house. Since coming into our care, both kids had really thrived. Tim seemed less affected than his twin, always ready to help Sonia. Like me, she had burn marks covering much of her body, including part of her face. She was still a bit fragile, but was growing stronger every day. On the table, we had set out sandwiches, party pies, and hot sausage rolls. There were drinks, including juice and soda. Both kids were eyeing a block of chocolate that was saved for later. I had just received a message from Betty saying she and Andrew were parking and would be here soon when everything changed. Tim and Sonia were trying to be helpful. Suddenly, Sonia looked up and let out a loud scream. Her panic was obvious, spreading across the park where we were sitting. I saw what had alarmed her and started to turn to look. Before I could move much, a strong arm wrapped around my neck, pulling me backward. I'm a big guy, so instinctively, I tried to push the arm away. But there were others ready to help. As the first person let go, two more grabbed my shoulders and forced me down to my knees. "Look at that," a familiar mocking voice said. "Crispy has found some little versions of himself." I focused on Brian Dumont, who stood a few steps away, flanked by three men who looked similar to him. The two holding me were pressing down on my legs while I tried to stay steady, but I could turn my head to see Tim and Sonia. They were trying hard to stay quiet, held by another man. I didn't like the sneaky grin on his face. I looked back at Dumont. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to stay calm in front of my old enemy. "Revenge," he shot back. "You had me arrested, and now I plan to make you pay before you can go to the police. You will write a statement to make sure I get off easy." My family had to help me escape the country. And now you need to fix this for me or face serious consequences, Dumont. "Leave me alone, Dumont," I said sharply. "This is your fault, not mine. My answer is no. Now let me go and step back before I lose my patience." Dumont laughed harshly and looked at me with disdain. "You don't understand, Crispy," he said, nodding his head. Just then I felt a sharp jab in my back, and Sonia let out a cry before falling silent. I looked over and saw that Dumont had his hand over her mouth. I glared at him. "If you don't do exactly what I say, my cousins and I will hurt all three of you. I know you don't care about yourself, but think about your young friends." "We will tell the police," Tim started to say, but Dumont struck him hard. "Quiet," he ordered in a heavy French accent. The two holding me had to poke my side several times before I calmed down. Once they had me pinned again, Dumont stepped closer and hit me. I spat blood from my lip and focused all my anger on the man in front of me. "You're weak, Dumont," I said after a moment. "You hit like a child." I wanted to shout at him, but I didn't want to scare the kids with my anger. He stepped forward and hit me again, the sound ringing in my ears. "You're an outcast!" Dumont shouted, frustrated because I wasn't giving in like before. "Do you really think you can talk to me like that?" "Absolutely," I said quickly. "It takes both of your goons just to hold me still. And if anything happens to my friends," I smiled grimly, "you won't be able to stop me from making you regret it." For a moment, I saw fear on his face. If it weren't for the others, I would have made my move. I wasn't a fighter, but I was much bigger than Dumont. I probably could have broken free and done some damage if it weren't for the guy near the kids. Dumont composed himself again. "So just do what I say, and they won't get hurt," he attempted to assure me. But I didn't believe him at all. "I can't trust you, Brian," I replied, using the name we shared. "You know my words mean nothing in a French court. Besides, the charges didn't come from me. They came from Lorandra." He sneered and got close to my face. I could smell cigarettes on his breath. "How does it feel, Crispy?" he said with a smirk. "Once again, I ended up with the girl you liked, and wow, she was amazing in every way. I had a great time with Lorandra, and I'm still thinking about going back for more when she returns to Australia. Who knows? Maybe now that she's with me, I could settle down and start a family with her." He seemed a bit out of touch. Maybe had too much to drink, or just didn't know what was going on. If he had, he would have known that Lorandra and her agency were taking legal action against him for spreading false information and damaging my fiancé's reputation. I glanced at the kids. Tim had a red mark on his cheek from where he'd been hit, but he was being brave, looking for a way to help his sister. Sonia had tears in her eyes. I threw my head back and laughed. "You fool," I fired back. "You never got close to her. I know for a fact Lorandra wouldn't want anything to do with you, even if you gave her $1 million. You're just a parasite, Dumont. You never understood it, but I wasn't wise to it either until recently." He didn't say anything. I sighed. "Look, Brian," I said, trying to ease the tension. "The truth is you never had a chance with Lorandra. We both know you never had a relationship with her before, and you won't in the future. She will never have children with you." "Yeah, right," Dumont said, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "You saw the pictures, I know you did." I nodded, keeping my calm. "Yes, I did, and it upset me enough to keep me in the hospital for a night." Dumont smiled, thinking he had the upper hand. "But that doesn't change the fact that you and Lorandra are not meant to be. I know the pictures are fake, and besides, she is with someone else," I said firmly. If he didn't know the latest about my relationship, maybe I could use that to my advantage and help the kids escape. "Yeah, her ex, Tommy," Dumont said smugly. "She played you, Crispy, used you for attention. She's going to marry Tommy, and you'll just be stuck here with these 2 kids." All 4 of the men laughed. I shook my head. "No, she's not with Tommy," I told him. "I just needed a little more time. Surely someone heard Sonia scream. There weren't many people around yet, but there were some in the distance who might notice and come to help." He scoffed at me. "You really think a woman like Lorandra would ever be interested in a guy like you who has to hang out with kids that look just as rough?" Before I could respond, a new voice broke in. "Yes, he is," my fiancé said. "He is the strongest and most handsome man I have ever met." Standing next to my bride was Andrew, along with 2 police officers. One was using a radio, likely calling for help. "I'm so amazed by Brian Other," Betty said. "I love him more than anyone can know, and we're getting married soon. Not only will those 2 kids you are holding join my husband and me as a family, but I also plan to start a family with him." Dumont looked shocked at Betty, then at me, and back again. I smiled widely at his surprise, and Betty was just as happy sharing her love for me. Dumont glanced at the kids, and as he did, I felt the two who were holding me relax at the sight of the police. Suddenly I was free and stood tall, sending them backward. I could still feel the earlier hits to my side, but I didn't care. I wanted to make a statement to Dumont. "Give it up, Dumont," I said firmly. "This isn't high school anymore. I'm not that kid you picked on. I've changed. I have people who care about me. I'm engaged to the most wonderful woman, and I know she loves me deeply." You've read about great love stories. Well, now you can add Lorandra and Brian Other to that list. It's a bond that you can't break. He glared at me, anger flashing in his eyes. "Fine," Dumont replied. "Then just vanish." Everything seemed to slow down in that moment. Dumont reached into his waistband, and I feared he was pulling out a weapon. The police were also drawing closer, but there were people in the way, including the kids. I knew they wouldn't shoot. I saw his fierce look and realized I had to act quickly. If he meant to harm me, others could be in danger too. As I said, I'm not one for fighting. Despite my size, I usually avoided conflicts and would rather walk away. But as Dumont tried to pull the weapon, I was already moving. He was only a few steps away from me, and I didn't need to move far. At the same time he turned to aim at me, I stepped forward, ready to defend myself. The sound Dumont made when I made contact was surprising. He staggered back and lost his grip, dropping the weapon. As my foot hit the ground, I threw my fist and knocked him down. He landed hard and lost 2 teeth while the gun flew away several feet. Suddenly, the police shouted orders, their guns ready, telling everyone to lie down. Dumont was already out cold, but the others quickly followed orders. To stay out of the way, I sat down. One of the officers gave me a thankful nod as he carefully moved to keep everyone away from the gun. In just a few minutes, nearly a dozen officers surrounded us, along with an ambulance crew. Media vans started to arrive, clearly alerted to the situation. Dumont lay face down on the ground, now in handcuffs. Sonia was sitting on my lap, and Betty sat next to me, gently cleaning my injured hand. Tim was in her lap as we waited. Andrew went over with an officer to speak with the media after getting our approval. "You haven't heard the last from me, Crispy," Dumont shouted, face down on the ground. I could see blood on his face, and he looked hurt. But no one rushed to help him. Instead, the ambulance crew made their way to us, and I made sure the kids would get checked first. Sonia made a little noise in response to Dumont. "You know?" she said sweetly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Bryan's going to be my dad soon. He has so much love and forgiveness, and I know he would forgive you if you asked." She looked up at me, and I smiled back before turning to Dumont. "But I don't want him to forgive you. You wanted to hurt him. He's going to be the best dad ever, and you won't get anything from my dad, my brother, or my mom," she said, looking at Betty, who was smiling brightly. "You get nothing. I think you should go to jail and stay there." I was thinking a lot at that moment, and she was right. I wasn't going to forgive Dumont. But what struck me was that she called Betty Mum and referred to me as Dad. I gave her a little squeeze, and we just sat and waited. The ambulance crew came to check on the kids. Betty waved them away from herself and then glanced at me. Lastly, they looked at Dumont. In the end, 4 men, French nationals who claimed to be on vacation, were arrested on several charges. Brian Dumont received help for a broken nose, some lost teeth, a fractured cheekbone, and a serious injury. As for me, I was given some pain relief, a bottle of water, and an ice bucket while I waited in a police room for everything to be sorted out. Our wedding was streamed online, with several companies paying a lot to Betty's agency for the chance to show it. Betty looked beautiful in her simple white satin dress. She had no long train, just a lovely bouquet of flowers in her hands as she walked down the aisle with Andrew. Tim was the ring bearer, and Sonia was the flower girl. Harper was her maid of honor, and Trey was my best man. We invited only 50 people to the small church and kept everything relaxed and simple. I do not remember much else from that day, except that we danced, laughed with our friends, and had a wonderful time. I could see the joy in Betty's eyes, like she had just won something special. Sandra and my parents took care of Tim and Sonia while we went on our honeymoon. We spent a month on a tropical beach. For the first time, I spent most of the trip without a shirt. The hotel staff were very polite and never asked about my scars, nor did they mention the happy noises from our beachside bungalow. When we returned home, our adoption paperwork came through the next month. By then, the kids were already calling us Mom and Dad after our fun day in the park. Now, they could legally use our last name. 6 months later, when Betty got pregnant with twins, we were all so excited. Almost 9 months later, George and Pris were born, and Lorandra decided to leave professional modeling. I kept working with Jeff, taking care of my crew, and I enjoyed my job. Now, Betty, the kids, and I go to almost every barbecue invitation. I am very comfortable in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt. You might be curious about what happened to Dumont. He and 3 cousins are now serving 6 years in an Australian prison. When they finish their sentences, they will be deported, and Dumont will still have to deal with charges back in France for his earlier actions. I hope he faces serious consequences, but he is no longer my concern. I have my family, and my love for Betty grows stronger every day. 12 years later, I am walking my daughter down the aisle. Sonia looks beautiful in her gown, which is actually Betty's gown, passed down proudly by her mother. Sonia is marrying Tony, the captain of the local university's football team. They went to high school together. One day, some of his friends were making fun of Sonia because of her appearance and scars. He stood up for her, and he says he fell in love when she looked at him and gave him her special smile. At first, I was a bit nervous. I worried that Tony might just be trying to hurt Sonia like Dumont had done to me long ago. But I was wrong. Tony has shown many times that he is a good man. For Sonia. Harper, Sandra, and Betty haven't let me worry too much about him dating my oldest daughter. Tim is still with his high school girlfriend. She is a lovely redhead, and I think he will propose soon. As for Betty, she never returned to modeling full-time. After George and Pris, she did a few shows, but then started her own agency with Sandra. They are doing well and represent notable models in Australia, the UK, and the US. During the wedding photos, Sonia posed with me. We both smiled proudly, showing our scars. They have become a mark of strength instead of shame. At the wedding reception, I had a special dance with Sonia. We both cried as we swayed to the music. When the song ended, I handed her over to her husband, and Betty took my arms. "My hero," Betty said, as I admired my wonderful wife. "No, you're mine," I replied, leaning down to kiss her. Her lips felt just as lovely as they did many years ago when she first caught my attention. She laughed, drawing smiles from the crowd around us. Betty, once known as Lorandra, touched my cheek, tracing the scar softly. "We've done well, haven't we?" I asked as we danced close together. "The famous model and the man with scars." She smiled at me, knowing that while I still feel a bit unsure about my looks, they no longer stop me from being seen. I have even been part of advertising campaigns that help burn victims feel proud of themselves. Betty shifted her hand to my chest, bringing me back from my thoughts, and then gently supported my chin. "We've done great, babe," she said, looking over at Pris, who was chatting with some of George's friends. Pris has her mother's looks but wants to study medicine, not modeling. George enjoys working with his hands and hopes to learn a trade after high school. I couldn't be prouder of all 4 of my children. I noticed Betty take a deep breath. So, the kids have their own room tonight, Betty said softly. I raised an eyebrow, a little surprised. I hear that former supermodel LaRondra is having a special show tonight, away from curious onlookers. How special? I ask with a smile. My wife leans closer to me. Just for you, honey. Just for you. I smile back. Life is good. Hey, everyone. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.